A farmer saves a baby calf during a flood, but just days later, an entire squadron of planes flies over his farm. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The roar of the rainstorm was the kind of sound that made folks bolt their doors and stay inside. In a quiet stretch of the Midwest, where open fields met winding riverbanks, Henry Hank Thatcher stood knee-deep in swirling floodwater, fighting against a current that threatened to drag him under. He was in his late 50s, wiry but strong from a lifetime of farm work. Tonight, though, he looked like a man half his age, moving with a fierce determination only desperation could spark. "Easy there," he muttered under his breath, straining to keep his footing in the fast-rising water. Just ahead, a calf bleated in fear. Its pitiful cries cut through the rumble of thunder like tiny shards of glass. Hank braced himself and pushed onward, every muscle aching. He could have turned back. Any sane soul might have. But leaving that calf to drown wasn't an option he could live with. The calf belonged to one of his oldest friends, Joe Patterson, who lived a few miles downriver. Joe and his wife were off visiting relatives, oblivious to the flash floods that had turned these meadows into a swelling lake. Hank had discovered the stranded animal entirely by chance while making a final check of his own property, worried about a breach in the levee that separated his fields from the rising river. One look at that trembling newborn, and Hank had known he couldn't walk away. Lightning flashed, giving Hank just enough illumination to spot the calf's head bobbing behind a half-submerged fence. Every few seconds, the poor thing tried to scramble onto the fence line, only to slide back into the currents. Hank's boots sank in the muddy ground, but he pushed himself forward, ignoring the sting of rain that hit his face like needles. He could almost feel the swirling water gnawing at his legs, as though trying to bury him in mud, right where he stood. In the distance, the barn lights on his own farm flickered. The power lines were dangerously close to flooding, which meant it was only a matter of time before the electricity cut out altogether. The thought of that happening made him move faster. He had to get the calf to higher ground, and quickly. With one last surge, Hank reached the terrified animal. The calf's eyes were wide and panicked, as if it had never seen anything so frightening in its short life. Hank slid an arm around its chest, feeling the creature's heart racing like a wild drum. "Hang on, little fella," he whispered, his voice steady despite the adrenaline pulsing in his veins. "We're getting out of this together." He shifted his weight, tried to lift the calf, and almost lost his balance when the current tugged him sideways. Mud oozed past his boots, swirling around him in a torrent that threatened to pull them both into deeper waters. Hank clenched his jaw, adjusted his hold on the calf, and forced one foot in front of the other. It felt like wading through quicksand. Each step was harder than the last. Rain pelted them mercilessly, thunder shaking the sky every few moments. Somewhere behind, the river raged, creeping further onto the farmland that Hank had worked tirelessly to protect. He could feel the raw power of nature all around him, a reminder of how small a man was in the grand scheme of things, yet giving up never crossed his mind. Some folks said Hank Thatcher had a stubborn streak a mile wide. He liked to joke that it took stubbornness just to be a farmer nowadays. There were always troubles, a drought one year, pests the next, prices of feed climbing unpredictably, and of course the dreaded floods that came every spring. Through it all, Hank kept planting, kept tending, kept believing that it was all worth it. And when a helpless animal needed saving, that was enough reason to fight the worst of storms. After an agonizing trek, Hank reached an incline leading back toward his property. The calf shivered in his arms, exhausted but alive. With one last effort, Hank heaved the little creature onto drier land. The calf staggered a few steps, then collapsed, breathing hard. Hank fell to his knees beside it, panting from the strain. For a moment, the farmer and the baby calf simply stared at each other in the hammering rain. Then, with a quiet grunt, Hank scooped the little one into his arms again and trudged up the gravel path that rose from the flooded fields. Once he reached his yard, he could see the lights in his modest farmhouse flicker yet again before darkness finally took hold. "Sure enough," he murmured. "Power's gone out." He carried the calf to his barn, carefully setting it down on a patch of dry straw inside an empty stall. The old barn smelled of hay and horse tack, a familiar comfort in an otherwise grim night. Hank grabbed several blankets and set about drying the little animal, speaking in low, reassuring tones to keep it calm. "Joe's lucky to have you," he murmured. "Let's see that we get you warm, huh?" The wind howled outside, rattling the barn doors. Rain battered the roof in a deafening roar. Hank made sure the calf couldn't wander off into danger, then stepped outside to check on the rest of his property. Even in the darkness, he could see water creeping across the yard, inch by inch. He cursed under his breath. If the floodwaters kept rising, they'd reach the barn by morning. For hours, Hank worked alone, piling sandbags in strategic spots, doing whatever he could to redirect the water away from the barn and his house. His arms burned from hefting each heavy sack, but the idea of letting that calf, and the rest of his livelihood, be washed away spurred him on. He was soaked to the bone, numb with cold but unstoppable. By the first glimmer of dawn, the storm clouds began to lighten, though the rain still fell in a steady drizzle. Hank stumbled back into the barn, exhausted, and checked on the calf. The animal blinked sleepily at him, already appearing a bit stronger, though it still trembled from shock and chill. Outside, a muddy lake sprawled where the lower fields used to be. A battered fence post stuck up at a strange angle, evidence of the night's violent waters. Hank sank onto a bale of hay, breath shuddering out of him. He'd saved the calf, at least. That was one victory. The rest of the day would be spent figuring out how to salvage whatever he could of his farmland. His gaze drifted to the calf, and a wry smile tugged at his lips. In the throes of the storm, all he'd thought about was saving the poor creature. Now it occurred to him that maybe, just maybe, that act of kindness would ripple outward in unexpected ways. Farming taught a man that every action, no matter how small, could have consequences down the road. Seeds planted today could sprout in surprising ways tomorrow. In the days that followed, Hank kept the calf safe and warm while he waited for Joe Patterson to return. The story of how he'd waded through a raging flood spread quickly around the area. Folks had always respected Hank for his honesty and work ethic, but this time they admired his courage too. Several neighbors stopped by to lend a hand with the cleanup, offering hot meals and good company. As the waters receded, Hank's farmland emerged battered but not beaten, much like the man himself. There were fences to fix, debris to clear, and battered ditches to repair. Hank tackled these chores one at a time, occasionally pausing to check on the calf that had, in a sense, become a temporary member of his farm family. He even found himself naming the little one Lucky, because it felt right after all they'd been through. When Joe finally made it back, he was overwhelmed by Hank's selflessness. He offered to pay for the damages, but Hank refused. "We help each other out here," was all Hank would say. Joe insisted at least on covering the cost of a veterinarian's visit, and Hank relented with a shrug. For a brief moment, it seemed life would slip back into its usual rhythm, a daily routine of feeding animals, tending fields, and weathering whatever came next. But something strange happened just a few mornings after the rescue. Hank was out by his porch, sipping coffee and gazing at the horizon, when he heard a distant rumble. At first, he assumed it was thunder, but the sky was bright and clear for once. Then the sound grew louder, more mechanical, like an engine's roar multiplied several times. He walked into the yard, shading his eyes, and saw not one, not two, but an entire formation of planes rising in the east, flying in precise formation toward his land. The morning sun glinted off their wings. For a second, Hank thought it might be a local air show, except he hadn't heard about any event like that. Besides, these weren't old stunt planes. They looked official, possibly military. "Why in the world?" he whispered. A swirl of questions filled his mind. Planes didn't just appear out of nowhere, especially not in such a disciplined group, unless they were on a mission or staging some demonstration. But what business did they have flying over a small farm in the Midwest? The engines roared overhead. Hank's pulse quickened. He half expected them to drop down lower, but they maintained altitude, cutting a path across the sky that seemed almost purposeful. A wave of confusion mingled with an unexpected flicker of apprehension. Were they lost? Were they heading towards some emergency? Or, impossibly, had they come because of him? That last notion felt absurd. He was just a farmer, after all. Sure, he'd saved a calf in a dangerous flood, but that didn't warrant a squadron of planes. Yet there they were, exactly 9 of them, flying in a sweeping arc across the morning sky. The distant thunder of their engines slowly faded, leaving Hank standing in his yard, coffee cup in hand, heart thumping with unanswered questions. He glanced over toward the barn where Lucky was resting. The calf stirred, as though sensing the vibrations in the air. Something big was happening, something that went beyond a simple rescue. Hank could feel it in his gut. This was just the start. What had begun as an act of compassion was spiraling into a mystery. As the last plane disappeared beyond the tree line, Hank took a long breath. If life as a farmer had taught him anything, it was to be ready for surprises. He set his coffee cup down, mind churning with possibilities. Something told him that this was about more than just gratitude for saving a calf. And whatever it was heading straight for him. For a long moment, Hank just stood there in his muddy yard, coffee cup forgotten on a fence post, eyes fixed on the empty sky. He felt as though the roar of those engines still reverberated in his chest, echoing questions with no answers. He glanced down at the ground, half expecting to see fresh tire tracks or footprints, as if someone might have slipped onto his land to stage the whole thing. But the muddy earth revealed only the usual patterns of his own boots. With a soft grunt, he turned toward the barn. No sense standing around in the drizzle, gawking at the clouds. He had chores to do, fences to mend, a calf to feed. If there was some significance to that flyover, maybe it would come to light in its own time. Inside the barn, Lucky greeted him with a soft bleat. The calf was getting stronger by the hour, now able to stand on wobbly legs without tipping over. Hank knelt beside the small creature, gently running a hand along its flank. "We had company this morning," he said. "Bet you didn't sleep through that racket, did you?" Lucky blinked, tail swishing in timid curiosity. He retrieved a bottle of milk replacer he'd purchased from the local supply store earlier that week. In the days since the rescue, Hank had taken on a surrogate caretaker's role, ensuring Lucky was well fed. Joe Patterson, the calf's rightful owner, was still away. Communications in the region had been spotty because the flood had damaged phone lines. Hank planned to bring the calf to Joe once everything settled, but for now, he was determined to keep the little one healthy. Rain drummed lightly on the barn's tin roof as Hank fed Lucky, the rhythmic patter a reminder of how quickly fortunes could change. A week ago, the flood had nearly claimed the calf's life. Today, Lucky was gaining strength, thanks to Hank's care. Outside, the yard was a patchwork of soggy grass and standing water. The sun might peek through later, but for now, the clouds clung to the horizon. After finishing the feeding, Hank set about the day's tasks. First was a thorough check of the fences that bordered his property. The entire lower field had been underwater, and he suspected the force of the current might have snapped some fence posts clean off. Sure enough, down by the southwestern corner, a section of fencing lay splayed out in the mud, wire twisted like so much tangled ribbon. Hank sighed. Fixing that would be a full afternoon's job, and with the ground so saturated, it wouldn't be pleasant. He hauled tools and spare posts to the damage site and began the slow, tedious work of repair. Each post had to be redriven into the earth, each strand of wire pulled taut. While he worked, his thoughts meandered back to the planes. Was it possible they were just training flights from an airbase? The nearest facility he knew of was a National Guard station 2 counties over, but it didn't usually send planes so far afield in formation. And if they were, why here? Why now? By lunchtime, Hank had made decent progress on the fence, despite the sludge. Taking a break, he wiped sweat from his brow and listened to the hush that spread over the fields. The storm's aftermath had cast a strange calm on the countryside, only the drip of water from leaves and the distant squawks of birds searching for worms. He squinted at the sky as if expecting another wave of aircraft, but all he saw was gray. He grabbed a thermos of lukewarm coffee from his pickup, leaned against the side panel, and tried to recall if he'd heard any local news about commemorative flyovers. Sometimes they did them for veterans on Memorial Day or for local heroes in the wake of a big event. But Memorial Day was still weeks away, and he certainly wasn't a hero, at least not in his own mind. Yet the idea nagged at him. Was there some chance folks were calling him that? He'd heard the talk around town, neighbors calling him brave for risking his life to save a newborn calf. A local reporter had even left a voicemail asking for an interview. Hank had politely declined. He didn't see anything heroic in simply doing the right thing at the right time. In his experience, that was just good citizenship. He sighed, finished his coffee, and got back to work. An hour later, he was hammering a new post into place when he heard the distant crunch of gravel behind him. He turned to see a dark sedan rolling up the narrow dirt path. It wasn't a neighbor's pickup, nor was it Joe Patterson's rickety station wagon. Something about it made Hank set aside his hammer. Visitors were rare, especially unannounced, and the battered yard was hardly inviting to strangers. As the car came to a stop, a man in a crisp suit stepped out, quickly skirting the mud puddles. He wore polished shoes and carried a small briefcase, looking thoroughly out of place in a landscape dotted with tractors and fence posts. Hank felt a slight prickle of caution. This wasn't the usual sight in farmland territory. "Mr. Thatcher?" the stranger asked, voice raised just enough to carry over the short distance. Hank nodded, stepping closer. The man offered a polite, tight-lipped smile. "My name's Aaron Grant. I work with the Federal Aviation Administration. I wondered if I might speak with you for a moment." Hank's eyebrows lifted. The FAA. His mind jumped to the planes, though he couldn't fathom what they'd want with him. "Sure," he said, setting down his tools. He wiped his hands on his jeans. "I got a minute." Grant glanced around, taking in the muddy expanse. "I apologize for showing up unannounced, sir," he said, "but it's about the squadron of planes that flew over here this morning. We have reason to believe they deviated from their flight plan to make that specific pass. Did you notice anything unusual about their formation or altitude?" Hank blinked, trying to process the question. "I noticed them all right," he replied slowly. "Not exactly a common sight, but I don't know why they'd pick my farm. It wasn't low enough to be dangerous, just close enough to make a racket. Didn't see any reason behind it." Grant nodded, producing a notepad from his briefcase. "I understand. We're still investigating ourselves. We have records that suggest these were privately owned planes, all under the same sponsor, but flight logs don't show a planned route over your property. We were hoping you might have seen a tail number or recognized any insignia." Hank let out a short, incredulous laugh. "I'm no expert, sir. All I saw was a wedge of planes overhead. Wasn't looking to read any numbers." He paused, considering the possibility. They were in tight formation, though, almost like they were putting on a show. The FAA agent made a note. "Well, if you remember anything else, please give me a call." He pulled out a business card. "We might have more questions, especially if they come back." Hank took the card, feeling a strange mix of curiosity and unease. "I'll keep my eyes open," he promised, though he couldn't imagine what else he might report. The agent's presence only deepened the mystery. Planes in formation, apparently off their official route, flying right over his fields. It didn't make any sense. Aaron Grant lingered a moment longer, glancing at the half-repaired fence. "Looks like the flood did a number on you." Hank nodded. "It's been a rough week, that's for sure." "Folks in town say you saved a calf from drowning," the agent remarked, as though discussing the weather. "That's quite a story." Hank pursed his lips. "News travels fast, I guess. I just did what anyone else would do." He sensed the agent might be fishing for a connection. Could the flyover be some bizarre tribute to that deed? The notion seemed far-fetched, but what else could explain it? Grant gave a small shrug, obviously unconvinced. "Well, if we learn anything more about the planes, we'll be in touch. Thanks for your time, Mr. Thatcher." He headed back to his sedan, careful to avoid the puddles, and disappeared down the gravel road. Hank watched the car fade, 100 fresh questions swirling in his mind. He returned to his fencing, but his thoughts were far from the manual labor. If the FAA was involved, that meant this wasn't just local rumor, it was official business. Yet he hadn't imagined for a second that the pilot group was lost. They'd flown in such a neat formation. So why circle his farm? After wrestling with broken fence wire for another hour, Hank decided to take a breather for lunch. He ate a sandwich by the barn, checking on Lucky, who now seemed well enough to nibble on a bit of hay. Hank chuckled at the calf's wide-eyed curiosity. "You think the planes were for you, buddy?" he teased. "You're the reason I got my name in the paper after all." He mulled over what he knew. He'd rescued the calf. Some neighbors praised him for it. A local paper wanted his story, and now an entire squadron of private planes had buzzed overhead in perfect formation. Then, a man from the FAA turned up, asking questions. Hank had that nagging feeling when a puzzle piece didn't fit. He wanted to lay the puzzle out flat and see the whole picture, but it felt like half the pieces were missing. The day wore on, each chore overshadowed by the swirl of possibilities. Hank worked with methodical efficiency, trying to keep his mind from wandering too far. By dusk, he'd repaired the fence, cleaned debris from the ditches, and rechecked the barn. The house was dark again, still no power. But he'd set up a small generator to keep his fridge running and the lights on in the kitchen. Before heading in, he stopped by the barn one last time, flashlight in hand. Lucky lay curled up in fresh straw, dozing peacefully. The calf twitched as Hank approached, but relaxed when it recognized him. Hank felt an odd sense of pride. He wasn't new to raising animals, but seldom had he rescued one under such dramatic circumstances. He gave Lucky a gentle pat, then made his way back outside. Overhead, the moon played hide-and-seek behind ragged clouds, illuminating the muddy yard in silver patches. Hank stood for a moment, scanning the sky. No lights, no rumble of engines, just the distant croak of frogs in the swollen ditches. When he finally turned in, exhaustion weighed heavily on his limbs, but his mind churned with questions. Sleep came fitfully, dreams laced with images of roaring plains and swirling floodwaters. He jolted awake once, sure he'd heard a low-flying engine. But the house was silent, the only sound his own ragged breath. At dawn, he found himself in the kitchen, coffee cup warming his hands as he stared out the window. Even though the water levels had dropped, the land bore scars of the flood. Uprooted bushes, scattered debris, broken fence lines he hadn't yet fixed. He thought about how quickly normalcy could vanish. Life, as he knew it, could be changed in a single day by the force of nature or by the sudden appearance of planes in the sky. The day promised to be milder, at least. The local forecast predicted scattered clouds and a chance of light rain. Hank went about his morning routine, feeding his chickens and checking on the goats that lived in a smaller pen. That's when he spotted a pickup truck rumbling up the drive. He recognized it at once. Emma Hopkins, the local news reporter who'd tried calling him earlier. She parked next to his house and jumped down, camera slung over her shoulder. She was in her late 20s, quick to smile, and always on the hunt for a story. "Good morning, Hank," she called, stepping carefully around the mud puddles. "Mind if I ask a few questions?" He sighed internally, but Emma was a nice sort. She'd always been fair in her coverage of the local farming community. Maybe she'd heard about the plains, too. Maybe she wanted the same answers he did. "All right," he conceded, motioning toward the small patch of dry ground near his porch. "But keep it short. I've got chores." She grinned, setting down her camera. "Thanks. I wanted to ask about your heroic rescue." "Heroic's a big word," he cut in, rubbing the back of his neck. "I just saved a calf from drowning." "Sure, but folks in town say it was an amazing act of bravery," she pressed, voice brimming with genuine enthusiasm. "And then there's the squadron of planes that flew over. People can't stop talking about it. Some say it was a tribute. Others think the pilots were searching for something." Hank's eyes narrowed. "Do you think it's connected to the rescue?" Emma shrugged. "Hard to say, but the timing's peculiar. I heard rumor that a wealthy donor, a big name in aviation, caught wind of your story. If it's the same person who funds those private planes, maybe they decided to do something flashy to honor you." He nearly laughed. "That's quite a leap. But I did have a visit from the FAA, if that tells you anything." Her eyebrows shot up. "Seriously? They came out here?" "Sure did. Didn't learn much, though." Hank folded his arms. "They said the planes deviated from their flight plan. That's all I know." Emma whistled softly. "Well, that's even more intriguing." She paused, eyeing him with sympathy. "I can see you're not exactly comfortable being in the spotlight. But if there's a bigger story here, folks are going to keep asking questions, myself included." He nodded, grimacing good-naturedly. "I suppose so. Would you be open to an interview later today? I could bring a proper camera crew. We'd just do a short segment. Local farmers brave flood rescue. That kind of angle." Hank hesitated, torn between privacy and wanting to set the record straight. Maybe if he spoke publicly, the plane's sponsor, whoever that was, would come forward. "Let me think on it," he said at last. "I'll call you before noon." She smiled, clearly pleased. "All right. Thanks, Hank. Here's my card." She handed him a business card, thicker and more professional than he'd expected. "I really appreciate it." He saw her off, then trudged back to the barn. Lucky greeted him with a soft bleat, as if to say, "What now?" Hank couldn't answer that, because he had no idea. Hank woke the next morning earlier than usual, restless after a night of broken sleep. The half-sunken memory of those planes nagged at him like a half-heard whisper. It was still too early to call Emma and give her an answer about the interview. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon. So he did what any farmer would do with spare time on his hands. He got to work. He put on his boots, grabbed a jacket, and headed out to check on Lucky before tackling the rest of his daily routine. Inside the barn, he found the calf blinking in the dawn light that came through the small window up by the rafters. Hank smiled. "Mornin'," he said softly. "Ready for breakfast?" He'd grown fond of the calf's trusting gaze, which seemed to hold no memory of the near-fatal flood. Lucky nuzzled Hank's hand when he refilled its feed, as if to say, "Thanks for sticking around." Satisfied that the calf was content, Hank moved on to see if the rest of the animals were doing all right. He checked the goats next, finding them calm and curious as ever. The old nanny goat named Doreen gave a friendly bleat, but otherwise the small herd seemed unaffected by the recent chaos. The chickens were roosting in their coop, safe from the muddy patch outside that still glistened from yesterday's drizzle. Hank's boots sank a little in the soft ground, but it was manageable. He was grateful there'd been no overnight rain. The memory of the rushing floodwaters still lurked in his mind every time he heard so much as a drip. With the animals cared for, Hank paused near the side of the barn, gazing out over the land. Sunrise painted the sky in pastel stripes of pink and orange, and the battered fields gleamed like a promise of renewal. He took a deep breath. Then, in a quiet voice, he told himself that no matter what puzzle the plains presented, he wouldn't let it consume him. There was a farm to run. The world kept spinning with or without clarity about that mysterious flyover. He returned inside for breakfast, which he ate alone at the kitchen table. The power had come back in the night, giving him the luxury of hot coffee brewed fresh. He let the warmth of the mug settle his nerves. When the clock crept past 8, he picked up the phone and dialed Emma's number. She answered on the first ring, almost as if she'd been waiting for him. "Morning, Hank," she greeted, sounding cheery. "You think any more about that interview?" Hank swallowed. "I'll do it," he said, surprising even himself with the briskness of his decision. "But keep it simple. I don't want a big fuss." She promised it wouldn't be a spectacle. Just a short piece about the flood rescue, his life as a farmer, and maybe a mention of those planes. They agreed to meet at noon, right there at his farm. Emma would bring a cameraman, do a quick shoot, and be gone before chores demanded Hank's afternoon attention. After hanging up, Hank felt a tug of anxiety. He'd never liked publicity. In the old days, neighbors just looked out for each other without any fanfare. But times changed, and so had the way stories spread. If telling his side of things might help quell rumors, or even bring answers about the flyover, then maybe it was worth enduring a little discomfort. By mid-morning, Hank tidied up around the yard, pushing aside tools and scraps of wire left over from fence repairs. He made a mental note to hide the generator behind the barn. It was still humming away in case the power flickered again. The watery fields glistened in the distance, a backdrop that might look dramatic on camera. At exactly noon, Emma's truck rolled up, a small local news logo emblazoned on the side. A young man hopped out from the passenger seat, hoisting a camera onto his shoulder. Emma emerged from the driver's side, her face lit with the excitement of a fresh story. She waved as she approached. Hank felt his stomach do a small flip, but he forced a polite smile. They set up near the front porch where the light was decent. Emma gave Hank a quick rundown of how it would go. She'd ask a few questions, he'd answer, and they'd film cutaway shots of the farm and the barn. Simple enough. Hank nodded, though he couldn't help noticing the camera lens pointed his way felt bigger than it actually was. "Ready?" Emma asked, stepping in front of the microphone the cameraman held out. "Let's get it done," Hank replied, glancing at the lens nervously. She clicked her tongue in sympathy. "You'll do fine. Just talk to me, not the camera." "All right." They started rolling. Emma began with the basics, his name, how long he'd been farming, and how the flood had affected his land. Hank spoke plainly, explaining how the heavy rains had turned the fields into a small lake. Then she asked about the night he found the calf. He recounted the scene with quiet intensity, how the calf's cries had cut through the storm, how he'd waited out without a second thought, and how he'd fought to keep them both from being swept away. Emma's eyes shone with genuine admiration. "That's quite a story, Hank," she said. "And it's no wonder people are calling you a local hero. Do you think that could be why those planes flew over?" Hank shifted his feet. "I don't see how," he said. "I'm not sure why anyone would arrange that, especially a full squadron." She nodded, not missing a beat. "Have you learned anything new about the planes since the FAA visited?" "Nothing yet," Hank admitted. "I'd heard they might belong to a private sponsor, but that's just talk. Wish I could give you more, but I'm as puzzled as everybody else." Emma smiled sympathetically and turned to the camera. "Well, there you have it. Mystery still unsolved. But at least we know Hank Thatcher is the kind of farmer who won't let floodwaters stand in the way of saving a helpless animal. Reporting from Thatcher Farm, this is Emma Hopkins, Channel 4 News." The cameraman signaled they were done. Hank exhaled, relieved the main interview was over. Emma motioned for the cameraman to get some shots of the fields. Then she nudged Hank lightly with her elbow. "Thanks again. This'll air tomorrow night. If you want to watch, tune in at 6. He nodded. "Sure, thank you, Emma." She studied him a moment, then lowered her voice. "Between you and me, if there's more to this plain story, I hope you find answers. Could be bigger than we think, you know." "Maybe," Hank allowed. "I'll let you know if anything else happens." She gave him a grateful smile, then hurried off with her cameraman to film a wide shot of the muddy fields. By the time they drove away, Hank felt worn out from the brief ordeal. Still, the questions pressed at him like a weight. There had to be a reason someone flew that formation over his property. The FAA man said they'd deviated from their flight path. Emma had mentioned a rumor about a wealthy donor. Could someone with deep pockets have decided to make a gesture in his direction? He let the question rest for the moment. Work wouldn't wait. One of his goats had a limp that morning, and Hank needed to figure out why. With a halter in hand, he led the goat, Doreen, into the barn. Lucky was curled up in a corner, dozing. Hank carefully inspected Doreen's hoof, suspecting a small stone or bruise. Sure enough, a jagged pebble was lodged in the soft tissue. Hank worked it free, disinfected the spot, and wrapped it with a bit of gauze. The goat bleated in annoyance, but he knew she'd be grateful for the relief later. He glanced at Lucky, who watched him with mild interest. "You're next," he joked, though the calf needed little more than some additional feed and rest. His phone buzzed in his jacket pocket, likely a neighbor calling to chat about the interview they might have caught wind of. But as he dug it out, he saw a number he didn't recognize. For a moment, he considered letting it go to voicemail. Then something made him answer. "Hello?" he said, trying not to sound too wary. A woman's voice responded. "Is this Henry Thatcher?" "Speaking." "Mr. Thatcher, my name's Carol Donahue. I'm calling on behalf of Horizon Wings, a private aviation foundation. We'd like to set up a meeting with you at your earliest convenience." Hank's pulse quickened. Horizon Wings. He'd never heard of them, but it had the ring of something to do with planes. "May I ask what this is about?" "Certainly," Carol said in a friendly, polished tone. "We're interested in discussing a special recognition event. One of our donors read about your heroic actions during the recent flood. Well, perhaps we should explain in person. Could you meet us tomorrow in the city? Maybe around midday?" Hank hesitated, not liking the idea of driving to the city on short notice. But curiosity flared. If these were the same folks who'd arranged that flyover, maybe he'd finally get answers. He cleared his throat. "I guess I could make that work. Where exactly?" Carol rattled off an address for a small aviation museum on the outskirts of the city, near the regional airport. She promised to send him an email with the details. Hank jotted down the information, feeling both intrigued and uneasy. After he hung up, he found himself staring at his phone, processing the conversation. So the planes might indeed have been part of some orchestrated gesture. A private foundation wanting to recognize him for saving a calf. That idea felt almost surreal. But it also felt slightly more believable than the notion of random planes off course. Hank decided he couldn't ignore this. He finished up in the barn, his mind already leaping ahead to tomorrow's drive. He'd never sought attention in his life, and part of him wanted to politely decline. Yet the need to know the truth, and the slight tingle of excitement at the thought of an aviation museum, pushed him past his usual reluctance. By evening, the sky had cleared fully, stars winking above the farmland. Hank sat on his porch steps, sipping another cup of coffee, gazing over the quiet fields. He thought back to the moment he'd stood waist-deep in floodwaters, straining to pull that newborn calf to safety. He hadn't done it for fame or thanks. He'd done it because it was right. Now it seemed that one act of compassion had put him on a path he never expected. With a slow, measured breath, he reminded himself that tomorrow he'd walk into yet another unfamiliar scenario. But if adversity was anything a seasoned farmer knew, it was how to keep planting seeds in rough soil. He would meet these Horizon Wings folks, hear them out, and see what new puzzle pieces they had to offer. Maybe at long last, he'd piece together a clearer picture of this extraordinary chain of events. And if not, well, at least he could say he'd tried. Early the next morning, Hank wiped the sleep from his eyes and set off on the hour-long drive to the city. The countryside was still wearing its early spring colors, pale green buds on the trees, patches of wildflowers emerging along the highway. He rarely ventured this far from his farm and felt a knot of unease as he left behind the familiar fields, replaced by suburban sprawl creeping toward the metropolis. Traffic picked up gradually, and before long, he found himself navigating lanes thick with commuters. Even with directions scrawled on a piece of paper, he had to rely on the occasional sign to reassure him he wasn't lost. At last, he spotted the small aviation museum just off a lesser-used ramp. A modest sign reading Blue Sky Heritage Center stood near the entrance, overshadowed by tall fences that enclosed a handful of historic aircraft displayed on the museum grounds. He pulled into the parking lot, scanning the area for any sign of Carol Donahue. Only a few cars dotted the pavement. Hank's old pickup looked especially rustic among the newer sedans. Shutting off the engine, he took a steadying breath, grabbed his hat, and climbed out. A brisk wind greeted him, carrying the faint smell of jet fuel from somewhere nearby. The regional airport, presumably. Hank made his way toward the museum's entrance, a wide double door flanked by gray steel panels. As soon as he stepped inside, a wave of cooled air struck him, along with the subtle hush of a place designed to preserve history. The lobby featured posters of vintage planes and black-and-white photographs of pilots from decades past. A single desk stood off to one side, unoccupied for the moment. "Mr. Thatcher," a cheerful voice called. Hank turned to see a petite woman in her 40s, dark hair pinned back, approaching with an extended hand. "I'm Carol Donahue. Thank you for coming." He shook her hand. "Nice to meet you, ma'am," he replied. "Quite a place you've got here." She beamed with pride. "Isn't it? We partner with the airport to help educate the public about aviation's heritage." She gestured down a hallway. "If you have a moment, I'd like to show you something in our private gallery. That's where my colleague is waiting." Hank had hoped for a straightforward sit-down, but he followed her, figuring it was all part of the meeting. They passed displays of antique propellers, old pilot uniforms, and even a battered cockpit mock-up where kids could climb in and pretend to fly. Carol led him through a door marked "Staff Only," down a short corridor, and into a smaller, well-lit room that smelled of fresh paint and polished floors. In the center stood a gleaming single-engine aircraft, wings so spotless they reflected the overhead lights. A tall man in a casual blazer stood beside it, examining the fuselage with a critical eye. He turned when they entered, revealing a face lined with experience, maybe mid-50s, gray hair cropped close. "Mornin'," he greeted. His voice carried a warm timbre. "You must be Hank Thatcher." "That's right," Hank said, tipping his hat politely. "And you are?" "John Albright," the man replied. "I'm the director of Horizon Wings. Appreciate you coming all this way." Hank gave a curt nod, still unsure what this was all about. "I heard you might have some answers regarding that flyover near my farm." Carol and John exchanged glances. She cleared her throat. "Yes, we can explain, though it's a bit of a story. First, let me thank you for agreeing to meet. We understand it must feel odd being contacted out of the blue." Hank managed a half smile. "Odd's one word for it." He shifted his weight. "So what is Horizon Wings exactly?" "It's a non-profit organization," John said. "We specialize in awarding grants to small communities and individuals who demonstrate exceptional acts of courage or compassion connected to aviation in some way. Usually, that means we sponsor search and rescue pilots or help volunteers who fly disaster relief missions. But sometimes we recognize ground-based heroes too, if their actions align with our donors' vision." Hank almost laughed. "I'm no pilot, sir. Just a farmer who saved a calf from drowning." Carol's expression softened. We know it sounds like a stretch, Mr. Thatcher, but that rescue caught the attention of a major benefactor, someone who invests in philanthropic gestures nationwide. After reading your story, they coordinated a special flight demonstration to honor you. That's the squadron that passed overhead. Hank blinked, recalling the neat formation and the thunderous sound of engines. You're telling me they flew all those planes just to pay tribute to that one thing I did? John nodded. Correct, although the plan was to contact you first so you'd understand what was happening. Something went awry in their scheduling. By the time we realized it, they'd already made the pass. He shrugged, exasperated. We're investigating the miscommunication with the FAA. We never meant to alarm you. Hank let out a slow breath, absorbing the explanation. It felt bizarre, borderline surreal, that some wealthy patron would orchestrate that spectacle. Why me? He finally asked. I can't be the only person in the country who's rescued an animal. You're not, Carol agreed with a slight laugh. But the circumstances, risking your own life in a flood, saving a calf that wasn't even yours, resonated with certain folks. You showed a selflessness that our donor believes deserves public appreciation. They see it as an extension of the spirit that once drove barnstorming pilots to help neighbors in remote areas. Hank fiddled with the brim of his hat, trying to process the idea of being singled out for recognition. Pride tugged at him, but so did discomfort. I never expected anything like that, he murmured. I'm just a man doing what he thought was right. John nodded empathetically. That humility is precisely what draws interest. He gestured to the airplane behind him. Our donor thought you might be open to a small ceremony, plus a scholarship or grant in your name, something that helps local farmers or fosters rural emergency preparedness. Hank's eyebrows rose. A scholarship? Potentially, Carol said. Funds could be used for training first responders in your county, or perhaps to help 4-H clubs and future farmers of America. There are multiple possibilities. We'd like your input because we believe you deserve to guide the shape of this recognition. Hank felt his heart rate climb. He pictured kids in the local high school, some of whom struggled to pay for extracurriculars. He thought of how volunteer fire departments in the region were always short on equipment. The idea that a single good deed could ripple outward, bringing resources to the entire community, felt too good to dismiss. I don't know what to say, he admitted softly. You don't have to decide now, John assured. We just wanted to explain and see if you'd be interested. Hank paused, mind whirling. He'd come expecting maybe an apology for the noise or a quick handshake. Instead, he was staring at a chance to bring real improvements home. Is there some catch? He asked bluntly. No offense, but big offers sometimes come with strings attached. Carol smiled as though expecting the question. No real catch. Our donor likes to remain anonymous, so they ask that recipients attend a formal presentation or small ceremony where the story is shared. Beyond that, the funds would be under your discretion, as long as they benefit the community. We'd also plan some news coverage, but only if you're comfortable with it. News coverage. Hank could already picture Emma chomping at the bit to film that segment. Part of him wanted to run back to his quiet farm, away from prying cameras. But the notion of turning down an opportunity that might help local families weighed on him too. I might be open to that, he said slowly, voice uneven. But I'd want to talk to folks back home, see what they think, and I sure don't need a big personal spotlight. Let it be about what we can do for the area. That's exactly the spirit we're hoping for, John said, genuinely pleased. We'll provide an overview of funding options. You can decide how to allocate them, maybe with a small committee. We've done similar programs in other states. It can be a real boon to a rural economy. Hank looked down at his calloused hands, remembering how those hands had pulled Lucky from the flood. Now he was being offered something that felt every bit as surreal as that raging storm night. At length, he lifted his gaze, meeting Carol's eyes. I'll hear you out. Let's see what can be done. Her smile widened, and John stepped forward to shake his hand. Wonderful, the man said. We'll draft up some proposals. Meanwhile, we were hoping you could join us for lunch. We can talk details and get to know each other better. Lunch would be fine, Hank said. Though fair warning, I'm no city slicker. Just a simple meal is enough. Carol laughed lightly. Not a problem. The museum cafe has sandwiches. Follow me. They left the pristine gallery and its gleaming plane, walking back into the hallway. Hank couldn't help a final glance at the single-engine aircraft in the center of the room. It seemed symbolic somehow, something meant to soar, waiting for the right moment to leave solid ground. He tried to imagine how his father or grandfather would react to all this fuss. Probably they'd shake their heads, but maybe they'd also see the sense in using new opportunities to protect the farmland they loved. The cafe was little more than a corner with a few tables and a counter. Carol ordered a turkey club, John went for a salad, and Hank chose a roast beef sandwich. They settled at a table near a window overlooking a stretch of tarmac. Every so often, a small plane taxied by or lifted off, the rumble of its engine coming faintly through the glass. The conversation stayed easy at first. Talk of the museum's mission, jokes about Hank's longtime devotion to his farm animals. Midway through lunch, Carol placed a printed folder on the table. Inside is an outline of how we usually structure these grants. We can adjust it based on your preferences. We can also coordinate with local leaders if you want to propose bigger projects, like flood defenses or improved rescue equipment. Hank flipped through the pages, feeling like he'd stepped into someone else's dream. Words like grant disbursement and beneficiary oversight leapt out at him. This is substantial, he muttered, brow furrowing at the amounts listed. John nodded. You'd be the face of it, but we'd handle logistics. We just need your sincere buy-in. Hank swallowed. I never did any of this for a reward, but I can't ignore how something like this might help the county. Let me think on it a bit before I commit. Of course. Carol took a polite sip of her lemonade. We can stay in touch by phone or email. There's no rush. They continued chatting, the conversation mingling technical details with casual remarks. Every so often, Hank felt a jolt of unreality. He was a quiet farmer, no fancy degrees, no leadership training. Yet here he was discussing philanthropic grants. By the time they finished their meal, he'd decided that while the spotlight made him uneasy, the outcome could be too good to turn down outright. The flood had exposed vulnerabilities in the region's infrastructure. Maybe these funds could help fix that for future storms. As they wrapped up, John said, Before you go, one more thing. Our donor requested we invite you to a private air show in 2 weeks. It's where they originally intended to honor you. With your permission, we'd like to formally recognize your flood rescue there. Hank stiffened slightly at the mention of another big event, but he reminded himself that if he truly wanted to direct these resources to his community, he might have to play along. I'll consider it. Where's it being held? Riverton Municipal Airport, Carol answered. We'll send you all the details. It's a low-key event, just a handful of demonstration flights, but the donor would like you to attend. Hank let out a breath. All right. Send me the info. I'll see what I can manage. With that, the meeting concluded. He shook hands with both of them again. They escorted him back to the lobby where Carol promised to follow up soon. Then, with a swirl of questions in his mind, Hank left the museum, stepping into the midday sun. The farm felt 1,000,000 miles away. He climbed into his pickup, setting the folder on the passenger seat. Starting the engine, he peered at the museum sign once more. He still couldn't quite believe it. A private air show, a potential scholarship, thousands of dollars in grant money because he'd waded into floodwaters for a newborn calf. Life had an odd way of surprising a man. Rolling out of the parking lot, Hank merged onto the busy road, heading back toward the open fields and simpler rhythms of home. He kept glancing at the folder. Each time, his heart thumped a little faster. The future was knocking, and it didn't look like the quiet life he'd always known. But as farmland blurred past the windows, he decided maybe that was all right. Maybe it was time to see just how far one rescue could go. By the time Hank reached the outskirts of his hometown, the late afternoon sun cast long shadows over the rolling fields. The meeting at the museum had left him feeling both exhilarated and uneasy. As he passed the wooden sign welcoming him back to Thatcher County, he thought again about the possibilities that lay hidden within the folder on his passenger seat. A scholarship, a ceremony, a chance to do something bigger than just fix fences and raise livestock. It felt almost too big to handle. He steered his old pickup down the familiar two-lane road, nodding a greeting to a passing neighbor in a battered truck. Home. That was a comfort. Even if everything else seemed to be spinning out of control, he could rely on his land and animals to anchor him. Soon, he was turning onto the gravel drive leading up to his farmhouse. From a distance, he noticed Joe Patterson's station wagon parked beside the barn. Hank felt a surge of relief. Joe must have returned earlier than expected. He'd been meaning to call him about Lucky, but the phone lines had been finicky, and truth be told, Hank had been consumed by the flood cleanup and the swirl of recent events. Now, seeing Joe's vehicle in his yard gave him a chance to reunite calf and owner. As Hank parked and climbed out, Joe stepped out of the barn, a wide grin breaking across his weathered face. He was in his late 60s, a broad-shouldered man whose strength hadn't diminished much over the years. "Hank," he called, crossing the yard. "Heard all about your heroics while I was gone. Didn't expect to come home and find my calf in your barn, though." Hank smiled sheepishly, shook Joe's hand. "Flood came in fast," he said. "I found the calf stranded in your lower meadow. Figured you'd want him alive and well." Joe's eyes crinkled in gratitude. "I sure do appreciate that. Could have lost him if not for you. Mighty big favor, Hank." Before Hank could deflect the praise, Joe continued. "Little fella seems attached. Follows me around the stall, bleating up a storm. I might just call him Flood, but maybe that's too grim. Or you could call him Lucky, like I have been," Hank suggested, and Joe burst into a warm laugh. "Lucky it is," he agreed. Then he glanced around, face turning serious. "So what's this business about airplanes flying overhead? Folks in town are all riled up, saying you got yourself some big award." Hank scratched the back of his neck. "News travels fast, I see. Truth is, it's not settled. There's a group called Horizon Wings that wants to honor me. Something to do with a donor who read about the rescue." He gave Joe a quick version of the story, including the meeting at the museum. Joe listened carefully, arms folded across his chest. When Hank finished, Joe whistled. "That's quite a turn. We're used to good neighbors lending a hand, but not many wind up with entire squadrons overhead." "Tell me about it," Hank said with a wry smile. "Anyway, I'm still deciding. They're offering a grant, maybe some funding for community projects." Joe clapped him on the shoulder. "I can't speak for everyone, but I'd say go for it. If it brings resources, we all benefit. Don't let that country humility hold you back." Hank nodded, appreciating the support. The two men talked a while longer about the damage the flood had wrought on Joe's property. Joe explained he'd already filed an insurance claim, but doubted much would come of it. He'd lost a few acres of crops, and his fences were in tatters. Hank offered to lend a hand rebuilding once his own fields were fully secure. Just then, a car pulled into the drive. Hank squinted. Emma Hopkins again, the local news reporter, stepping out with a small camera. She waved, camera in hand, expression apologetic. "Sorry to pop in unannounced," she said. "But after that short interview, there's been a massive response. People really connected with your flood rescue, Hank." Hank raised an eyebrow. "Connected how?" Emma's eyes lit with professional excitement. "Calls poured into the station. One viewer even set up a crowdfunding page to support you. It's not huge, but I wanted to get your thoughts. Also, I heard rumors about some philanthropic group wanting a ceremony. Thought you might share details." Hank and Joe exchanged glances. Joe shrugged, deferring to Hank. Sighing inwardly, Hank motioned for Emma to come closer. "I did meet with the foundation. They're offering a grant, but nothing's final. As for crowdfunding, I don't need personal handouts. If folks want to support something, maybe we can direct that money toward a rescue fund or something that benefits the whole county." Emma's camera was already rolling. "That's a generous sentiment, Hank. Any idea how you'll handle the foundation's offer?" "I'm leaning toward it," Hank said slowly, feeling the pressure of speaking in front of a live camera. "But I want to talk to the county board, see where the funds can do the most good. If this is going to happen, it should help everyone, not just me." Emma grinned, clearly impressed. "I can't wait to report on that. Thanks for the update, and sorry for interrupting your day." Joe chuckled. "It's not every day we get local reporters and philanthropic organizations on this old farmland. Hank, you sure stirred up the pot." Hank managed a modest laugh, though inside he felt an odd swirl of pride and apprehension. Emma finished gathering her footage, asked if she could interview Joe about the calf rescue from the owner's perspective. Joe obliged, praising Hank's quick thinking. Once Emma departed, Joe turned to Hank, voice quieter. "You know you deserve whatever good comes from this. You've worked these fields alone too long, rarely asking for help. Don't be afraid to accept some kindness in return." A lump formed in Hank's throat. He pressed Joe's hand in thanks, then said goodbye as Joe loaded the now healthy Lucky into a small trailer. The calf gave a plaintive bleat, and Hank felt a pang of sadness watching the little creature go. Over the last week, Lucky had become more than just Joe's calf. He'd been a sort of companion in the midst of all this upheaval. But Hank knew the calf belonged with Joe. Besides, there were more pressing matters at hand. Late that evening, Hank found himself sitting at his kitchen table, the farm quiet now that Lucky was gone. He opened the folder from Horizon Wings, flipping through grant guidelines again. The numbers were staggering for a small community. If allocated properly, the funds could shore up levees or install better drainage to prevent future flood damage. Or, as Carol suggested, they might train volunteer rescue teams, build up an emergency supply cache. So many ideas. It almost overwhelmed him. He picked up the phone and called the county commissioner, an old friend named Ruben Delgado. Ruben answered with a surprised laugh. "Hank Thatcher. Calling at 8:30 on a weekday? Something big must be brewing." "You could say that," Hank replied, launching into a summary of the grant proposal. "I'm no politician, Ruben, but I figure the county might want to say if we can direct the money to bigger projects. Thought I'd get your take before forging ahead." Ruben listened, occasionally letting out murmurs of astonishment. "You're telling me a single private donor's willing to funnel thousands of dollars toward infrastructure or community programs because you saved a calf?" Hank shook his head, though Ruben couldn't see him. "Seems that way, yes. I know it's weird, but it's real. I've got all the documents." Ruben let out a low whistle. "This is unprecedented, Hank. Usually we scrape for state grants, and here you waltz in with a golden ticket. If you're comfortable with it, let's arrange a meeting with the county board. We can figure out the best approach together." "That's what I was hoping," Hank said, relief flooding him. "I don't want to hold the reins on something this big without some guidance." They agreed to schedule a small discussion session later in the week. Hank set down the phone feeling lighter, as though a weight had lifted. If local officials helped shape the plan, maybe the scrutiny wouldn't all be on him. Then again, he reminded himself that the donor might want a personal element, a ceremony or formal event. He grimaced at the thought, but told himself to focus on the good that might come from it. In the barn that night, the empty stall where Lucky had slept reminded Hank how quickly life could shift. The calf was safe, likely curled up in a new pen back on Joe's farm. In the short span of a few days, everything had changed for that animal. And, in a way, for Hank too. He found his mind drifting to the upcoming private air show. Would he really stand in front of a crowd, recognized by people he'd never met, while planes soared overhead? The notion sent an unsettling flutter through his stomach, but it also stirred a thread of curiosity. Maybe this was how the world rewarded quiet acts of kindness sometimes, by shining a spotlight, whether one wanted it or not. He drifted to bed with a mind that wouldn't settle, images of planes, waterlogged fields, and large donation checks swirling in half-formed dreams. Early the next morning, he woke to a slate-gray sky and the smell of damp earth, reminiscent of the flood that still felt fresh in his memory. A quick step outside revealed that the yard was drying up, though the ground remained mushy. After morning chores, he drove into town for supplies. As he walked into the feed store, a couple of neighbors approached, congratulating him on the prospect of the big grant. Word had spread, likely from Emma's report. Hank tried not to let their praise fluster him, but he was still adjusting to being singled out. He fielded their questions with polite humility and picked up his usual rations, plus a few extra fence posts. On his way out, he noticed a small bulletin board near the door. Someone had pinned up a notice for a community flood response meeting. The date matched the day he'd planned to speak with the county board. Perfect. He removed a pen from his pocket and jotted a quick note in the margin. Potential new resources. Hank Thatcher to share details. Then he stepped back and studied it, heart beating with the realization that he was about to become a public figure, however briefly, in a place he'd lived quietly for so long. On the drive home, Hank's phone buzzed. It was Carol, confirming the date of the private air show in Riverton. She asked if he'd attend for sure so they could finalize programs. He inhaled, thought about it, and then heard Joe's voice in the back of his mind. Don't be afraid to accept some kindness. All right, he said at last. Count me in. The following week raced by with a flurry of preparations for events Hank never imagined being part of. First came the county board meeting to discuss the grant. Several local officials gathered in a cramped conference room at the municipal building, eyes alight with curiosity and hope. Hank stood at the head of a rickety table, folder in hand, explaining the possibilities Horizon Wings had laid out. It felt surreal. He was just a farmer, but here he was, talking budgets and project allocations with the very people who handled county finances. Ruben Delgado, the county commissioner, sat with his hands folded. Hank, can you give us a sense of how flexible these funds are? For instance, if we wanted to improve levees along the river to prevent future floods, is that an option? As I understand it, Hank replied, the donor's open to any plan that benefits the community. There are few restrictions. We'd sign an agreement, but we'd have plenty of leeway. A murmur of approval drifted around the table. Councilwoman Marta Reyes spoke up next. What about emergency services? We lack trained personnel who can handle swift water rescues. If we'd had more expertise during this last flood, maybe we'd have saved more livestock and possibly prevented tragedies. Hank nodded thoughtfully. That's possible too. Horizon Wings specifically mentioned rescue training. We can definitely look into that. They spent an hour hashing out ideas, from drainage improvements to advanced warning systems. Hank took notes, feeling equal parts intimidated and proud that his farm rescue had sparked such constructive plans. By the time the meeting adjourned, they'd agreed to draft a proposal for Horizon Wings. Ruben patted Hank's back on the way out, a smile stretching across his face. This is going to mean a lot to folks around here. Thank you. Hank left the municipal building with a swirl of excitement dancing in his stomach. If all went smoothly, the money could transform how the county braced for floods. He knew his father, rest his soul, would be astonished by how far a single act of neighborly goodwill could go. But that was only half of Hank's obligations. He was also preparing for the private air show in Riverton. Carol from Horizon Wings had emailed a detailed schedule: a mid-morning arrival, a short meet and greet with the donors' representatives, and then a small ceremony where he'd be presented with a formal commendation. The very thought of standing in front of an audience made Hank's palms sweat. Growing up, he'd never been one for speeches. Yet, if the event opened doors to the funds he was now counting on, he owed it to his community to give it his best. The day before the air show, Hank took extra care tidying his farm. It wasn't that anyone from the event would visit, but he liked going into new experiences knowing his own house was in order. He spent a few hours clearing debris from the last flood, stacking broken branches and driftwood near the old fence line. Then he drove to the store in town for a new shirt. If he was going to be recognized publicly, he might as well wear something besides his faded work clothes. Browsing the modest racks of the local general store, he picked out a simple button-down shirt in a soft blue. The store clerk gave him a curious look, as though she couldn't picture Hank in anything but denim and flannel. By evening, the sky blushed with a fading sunset, and Hank sat on his porch, phone in hand, debating whether to call Emma. He knew she'd want to cover the event. Might as well let her know. After a moment, he punched in her number. She answered quickly, background noise of a busy newsroom filling the line. "Hey, Hank! To what do I owe the pleasure?" He cleared his throat, feeling awkward. "Figured you'd like to know I'm heading to that private air show tomorrow. The folks behind it plan to present some recognition. Maybe it's something you'd want to report on." She made a little exclamation of excitement. "Absolutely. Do you mind if I bring a cameraman? Or is it invite only?" "I can check, but I suspect it's all right. People from Horizon Wing said they'd do some press coverage eventually." "That's fantastic. Send me the details. I'll meet you there." After hanging up, Hank stared at the horizon, nerves buzzing. Tomorrow would be a day unlike any he'd lived before. A part of him questioned whether he was ready, but as Emma liked to say, the story was bigger than him now. The next morning, Hank rose before dawn. He did his usual chores, fed the goats, checked the chickens, then gave the fields a quick once-over. The sun climbed, turning the sky pale gold. By the time he'd showered and changed into his new shirt and a pair of clean jeans, it was nearly 7. The drive to Riverton Municipal Airport would take about 90 minutes, and check-in for the event was at 9:30. He climbed into his truck, that familiar swirl of apprehension twisting in his gut. The last time he felt so keyed up might have been years ago, driving to a cousin's wedding where he'd had to stand in front of relatives as best man. Public attention never came easy to Hank. Yet he reminded himself that this was for a worthy cause. He turned the key and rumbled away from the farmhouse. As the miles slipped by, farmland gave way to small towns, and eventually, the gentle urban sprawl surrounding Riverton. Traffic thickened. Hank kept a close watch on his lane. A large sign for Riverton Municipal Airport appeared up ahead. He followed it onto a broad road lined with airplane hangars, flight schools, and chain-link fences. At last, he spotted a parking area labeled AIR Show Parking. He pulled in and found a spot near the back, where a handful of vehicles already sat. Climbing out, he saw Emma's truck parked a few spaces away. She waved, stepping over with her cameraman in tow. "Morning, Hank. You ready for this?" "As ready as I'll ever be," he said, wiping clammy palms on his jeans. A pair of uniformed attendants checked their names off a list, directing them toward a roped-off section of the tarmac. Hank's heart thudded at the sight. A row of gleaming aircraft lined up, from vintage prop planes to sleek modern jets. People in aviation jackets milled about, chatting and gesturing. Off to one side, a small stage had been set up, complete with a podium and several folding chairs. Overhead, the sun shone fiercely in a cloudless sky, promising a hot day. Carol Donahue spotted Hank and Emma, hurrying over. She shook Hank's hand with a smile. "So glad you made it. We've got a seat for you right on stage next to John Albright and a few other honorees." Hank blinked. "Other honorees?" "Yes, we're recognizing a few folks today. Some volunteer medevac pilots, A retired Coast Guard rescue swimmer, that sort of thing. You'll be in good company." He exhaled, relieved he wouldn't be the sole focus. Emma and her cameraman slipped away to catch footage of the planes. Meanwhile, Carol guided Hank to a small tent behind the stage, where John was talking with a uniformed pilot. John greeted Hank warmly. "We've made a short program to thank you for your selfless deed," he explained. "We'll present a plaque, announce the grant, and then have a flyover by a few of our sponsors' planes." Hank almost laughed at the irony. More planes overhead, hopefully a tad less dramatic this time. He nodded, letting John lead him to a seat on stage. A cluster of about 50 spectators had gathered in front of the podium, among them a smattering of local news crews. Emma stood to the side, camera rolling, smiling encouragingly when Hank glanced her way. Before he could second-guess himself, the program began. A lively announcer took the mic, welcoming everyone to the show. Over the next half hour, the audience heard from a rescue pilot who'd flown tornado relief missions, a nurse who'd volunteered in remote clinics, and a father and son duo who used their private plane to deliver supplies to hurricane-affected regions. Each story underscored compassion and community, a theme that felt bigger than any single person. Finally, John stepped to the microphone and introduced Hank. "Sometimes bravery doesn't come at 30,000 feet, he said, voice resonating across the tarmac. "Sometimes it happens on the ground, in the midst of everyday life." Henry Hank. Thatcher of Thatcher County saved a newborn calf during a treacherous flood, risking his own life. While it may seem small, it exemplifies the same spirit we celebrate in all our honorees: the willingness to step into danger for another being in need. Hank's cheeks burned as applause rose. He stood, approaching the mic with wooden steps. Taking a slow breath, he tried to meet the crowd with composure. He could see the flash of a camera from Emma's direction. Well, he began, gripping the podium. "I'm not used to speeches. I just did what I thought was right. Didn't expect recognition, but I appreciate it, and I hope we can put this to good use back home. Help folks who face floods or other disasters. Thank you." It felt painfully brief, but the crowd cheered. John placed a framed plaque in Hank's hands, etched with his name. Then a swirl of orchestrated chaos ensued. Carol beckoned him aside for a photograph, and the official cameras snapped away. Emma's cameraman filmed close-ups of the plaque. Through the din, Hank caught bits of conversation about how the donation would soon make headlines. The sense of unreality crept higher. The announcer signaled an incoming flight demonstration. Everyone turned their eyes skyward. A trio of small jets roared into formation overhead, leaving wispy contrails behind them. The crowd gasped in delight. Hank felt the thunder of those engines in his chest, reminding him of the day they soared over his farm. Only now he knew exactly who was behind this display. After the jets disappeared, the field broke into clusters of conversation. Emma hurried up, microphone in hand. "Hank, care to comment on this big moment for local viewers? They'll want to know about that plaque." He cleared his throat. "Well, it's a real honor. I'm grateful to everyone here and looking forward to what this means for my community. That's all, really." She nodded, understanding his unease with the spotlight. "Thanks," she said, then pivoted back to address the camera. As the ceremony wound down, John and Carol pulled Hank aside. They talked specifics about the grant. Carol confirmed they'd share an official agreement in the coming days, once the county board finalized their proposal. In the background, planes still taxied, and the sun beat down mercilessly. Sweat trickled down Hank's neck, but he felt a quiet sense of accomplishment. This was bigger than him now, indeed. Finally, with the festivities ending, Hank excused himself to find a bit of shade. He spotted Emma, who signaled him over for a final question. The camera was off, so her tone felt more personal. "How do you feel?" she asked softly. All this attention, the plaque, the applause. He let out a breath. "It's humbling. I never aimed to be a symbol of anything. But if it helps us get that grant and protect folks from future floods, then I'll stand on as many stages as they ask." Emma's eyes shone. "I'm proud to cover your story, Hank. Let me know if I can help spread the word whenever the county plan takes shape." He nodded. "Will do." By mid-afternoon, the crowd thinned. Hank climbed back into his truck, plaque resting on the passenger seat, next to the folded shirt he'd worn on stage. He stared at the gilded lettering of his name, still unable to believe all this had sprouted from the night he dragged a shivering calf from a flooded pasture. Starting the engine, he eased out of the parking area. The day's events had left him exhausted in ways that felt more mental than physical. He set his sights on home, longing for the quiet fields where the biggest commotion might be a sudden bleat from the goats or the distant hum of a tractor. But beneath the fatigue, he felt a stirring of determination. He had a responsibility now, to shepherd these new resources toward real, lasting change in his county. The seeds had been planted. It was time to see what might grow. Hank's truck rattled over the uneven gravel as he left the airport behind, the plaque on his passenger seat catching stray beams of afternoon light. The drive home felt longer than usual, his thoughts flitting back to the ceremony he'd just experienced. Each time he glanced at that shiny award, he felt a mix of pride and disbelief, a reminder that the quiet path he'd walked for decades had taken a sudden, unexpected turn. Now, as the farmland rolled into view beyond the windshield, he braced himself for the aftermath of all this fresh attention. He could only hope it would bring positive change instead of simply stirring up curiosity. Upon arriving at his property, he parked near the barn and got out to inspect the yard. The ground was finally drying, and the fields smelled clean, as if the land itself was ready to move on from the flood. He carried the plaque inside, intending to set it down in some out-of-the-way corner. Yet, once in the living room, he paused, studying the plain wooden shelves by the window. They mostly held knickknacks and old family photographs. Slowly, he lifted a faded photo of his father and mother, the older man standing tall with a pitchfork in hand, the older woman beaming in her apron, and placed the plaque beside it. Somehow it felt right that the one symbol of Hank's newfound renown belonged next to the parents who'd shaped his love for the land. The next day, he woke early to catch the county radio news. Sure enough, Emma's voice came through the speaker, describing the private air show and the ceremony. She kept it brief but enthusiastic, explaining how Hank Thatcher's rescue had sparked a wave of community interest and a pending grant. Hank sipped his coffee, imagining neighbors all over the county listening to the same broadcast. He hoped none of them thought this was a vanity project. The real story was about building a safer future together. Late that morning, he found himself tinkering with his tractor in the barn, a necessary chore that helped ground him. As he oiled a stubborn mechanism, footsteps approached. Hank looked up to see Joe Patterson stepping through the barn door, doffing his cap in greeting. Joe was grinning wide. "Heard you on the radio, Hank. Quite the big shot now, huh?" "Sure," Hank drawled, brushing off the notion. "Still got a bulky tractor to prove I'm no different than yesterday." Joe chuckled. "Tractor or no, people in town are excited. I saw folks at the feed store talking about new levees, maybe a second rescue boat for the volunteer fire crew. You realize how much that'll matter if we get hammered by floods again?" Hank straightened, wiping grease from his hands. "That's exactly why I'm doing this. Figured if we can spare folks the heartbreak of losing livestock or property, it's worth the fuss. How's Lucky, by the way?" Joe's face lit up, happy as can be. "We've got him in a sturdy pen and he's growing fast. Seems to like the name you gave him. My grandkids think it's a hoot. Lucky the flood calf." Hank's chest warmed at that. Even in the swirl of changes, knowing the calf was thriving gave him a simple, unshakable satisfaction. He and Joe spoke a while longer, discussing the next county board session and whether folks in the farmland co-op might want a say in how the funding got divided. Joe offered to gather input from neighbors who'd been hit hardest by the recent flood. Hank thanked him, relieved he wouldn't have to shoulder every detail alone. Later that week, Hank visited the municipal building again, this time with a fuller plan. Ruben Delgado and the board members greeted him around a larger table than before. They'd assembled a handful of department heads, fire, roads, zoning, to weigh in. Maps lay spread out, showing drainage systems and county flood zones. While Hank sat quietly, the professionals hashed out a proposal that encompassed improved levee maintenance, additional training for first responders, and a new farmland drainage initiative. With each point, they turned to him for approval, as if he were the official gatekeeper. He kept reminding them he was just a conduit for Horizon Wing's funds. Still, they insisted his input mattered. After 2 hours of discussion, they'd shaped a draft. The group agreed to send it to Carol and John for final review, then schedule a public town hall to gather broader feedback. Hank left the meeting feeling a strange new energy. He saw how his ordinary farmland existence now intersected with bigger decisions. Perhaps that was how real change happened, a series of small personal acts that suddenly gained momentum, turning a lone farmer into a catalyst. In the days that followed, reporters occasionally called, curious about the timeline for the grant. Hank directed them to the county's website, grateful he no longer had to be the main mouthpiece. Meanwhile, Emma caught wind that the board had hammered out a plan and asked Hank for another short interview. They stood in front of the courthouse steps, Emma's camera capturing the official announcement. Hank mumbled his part, then stepped aside as Ruben Delgado described the proposals with confident flair. Deep down, Hank was glad to let Ruben do most of the talking. A quieter challenge soon emerged. One morning, a local blogger posted an article questioning Horizon Wing's motives. The piece insinuated that an anonymous donor might be using rural communities to gain tax benefits or to push some hidden agenda. Hank heard about it from a neighbor who followed internet chatter. At first, Hank dismissed it as rumor. But as the article circulated among skeptical residents, Hank realized he might need to address those concerns. He didn't know much about philanthropic politics, but he understood folks wanted reassurance. When Carol called him for a progress update, he mentioned the article. "I'm not accusing you of anything," he said, pacing near the barn. "But people are antsy when big money swoops in. They want to know if there's a catch." Carol sounded sympathetic. "I understand. Horizon Wings deals with that occasionally. We're fully transparent with financials and the donor isn't seeking personal gain. Let me email you some documentation you can share with the public if you like." Hank sighed in relief. "That'd help. It's not that people are ungrateful. They just fear what they don't know." She promised to send everything, along with a letter from the donor affirming there were no strings attached beyond the requirement that the funds be used for community improvements. Hank thanked her and hung up, hoping that would calm the storm of doubts. He recognized the region's wariness of outsiders came from decades of seeing city politicians make empty promises. The best way forward was honesty. Indeed, when he posted the donor's letter and the foundation's statements on the county website, the uproar died down. A few holdouts still muttered about potential hidden agendas, but most residents seemed relieved. Bit by bit, the path was clearing, replaced by cautious optimism that the improvements might benefit everyone. Hank realized how deeply this sense of community trust mattered. It was the quiet bedrock of rural life. Meanwhile, smaller changes took root. A local middle school teacher asked Hank if he'd speak to her students about farmland stewardship, tying his rescue story into a lesson on empathy. He hesitated. Public speaking still made him uneasy, but eventually agreed. Standing in a classroom, telling bright-eyed kids about caring for animals and helping neighbors left him surprisingly moved. They asked questions about Lucky, about the thunderstorm, about how it felt to nearly be swept away. Hank answered gently, reminding them it wasn't about being fearless, but about doing the right thing, despite fear. That weekend, Joe invited Hank to come see Lucky. The calf had grown, his legs no longer spindly but strong enough to frolic in the small pasture behind Joe's barn. When Hank arrived, a gaggle of Joe's grandchildren were there, giggling as they fed Lucky handfuls of grass. The moment Lucky spotted Hank, the calf trotted over, letting out a loud bleat as though recognizing its old rescuer. A few of the kids squealed in delight. "You see, Uncle Hank," Joe's granddaughter piped up, "Lucky remembers you." Hank crouched low, patting the calf's flank. "Hey, buddy, glad you're doing all right." That contented warmth spread through him again, a reminder that all these swirling developments traced back to that single decision in the flood. Saving one small life had set off a chain reaction. Joe chuckled, arms folded. "You planning on being that child's godfather if he could talk?" "Might just have to," Hank joked, though emotion tugged at his chest. "You take good care of him, Joe. He's a special one." They spent a while chatting, sipping lemonade beneath a shady oak tree, reminiscing about calmer days. Hank eventually excused himself, mindful of the new responsibilities piling up. He had a meeting scheduled with the local volunteer fire captain to discuss specialized training. As he drove away, Hank gazed at Lucky frolicking in the pasture, children laughing in the sunshine. That image reminded him how even the simplest act of kindness could ripple outward, touching countless lives in unforeseen ways. When he arrived at the fire station, the volunteer captain, Rosa Miller, greeted him. She was a wiry woman with an authoritative air, explaining how the station had struggled to obtain the equipment and training needed for water rescues. "We rely on donations," she said, "but it's never enough. With your help, maybe we can purchase proper gear for boat operations and protective suits." Hank listened intently, taking mental notes. He found it easier and easier to talk about distributing funds, especially when it involved tangible, life-saving measures. "We'll work something out," he promised. "Expect me to bring your ideas to the board once the final grant agreement is signed." That night, Hank shared a simple supper at his kitchen table, considering how drastically his days had changed. Where once he'd focused solely on planting schedules and feed orders, now he juggled calls from officials, reporters, and program directors. Yet he wouldn't go back to the old ways, not if it meant missing this chance to strengthen the community. He just hoped the momentum lasted. Finishing his meal, he took a short walk outside, letting the cool evening air clear his head. Starlight shimmered overhead, and in the distance, he heard a faint bleat from Joe's property. Lucky's voice, perhaps, echoing across the quiet fields. Hank smiled, lifting his gaze toward those stars. Yes, life had changed, but in ways that felt surprisingly right. Tomorrow he would finalize the county's official proposal and send it to Carol. Bit by bit, the future was taking shape, all because one farmer had refused to let a living creature drown. A few days later, Hank rose at dawn to the steady rhythm of rain pattering on his roof. He dressed in his usual work clothes, gulped down some black coffee, and stepped outside to feed the goats. The drizzle cloaked his fields in a gentle haze, and the air smelled clean, hinting at the coming spring warmth. Despite the clouds overhead, Hank felt a spring in his step. Today, he planned to send the finalized county proposal to Carol. That would officially set in motion the grants and programs everyone had been buzzing about. He found the goats unfazed by the drizzle, each of them awaiting breakfast with mild impatience. As he refilled the trough, he caught himself humming a tune. Over the past couple of weeks, he'd been juggling more paperwork and phone calls than he ever had in his life, yet something about it filled him with renewed purpose. No one had forced him into this role. He'd stepped up willingly, because it felt right. After chores, Hank walked back to the house and sat at his old computer desk. The county board had left him with a final draft of their proposal the previous evening. An itemized plan for levee improvements, equipment for local emergency services, rescue training initiatives, and a small portion earmarked for scholarships to agricultural students. Hank scanned it one last time, ensuring no details were overlooked. Then he typed a brief cover email to Carol, attached the proposal, and clicked send. A small thrill shot through him. This was it. He leaned back in his chair, picturing how, in a few months, the county might break ground on stronger flood defenses. He imagined volunteer firefighters wearing new gear, better prepared for dangerous waters. He saw local teenagers receiving scholarships that might lead them to innovative farming techniques. It was a bright picture, one that made him smile. His phone chimed. The screen displayed a text from Emma Hopkins. "Call me when free. Big news about Horizon Wings." Hank's brow furrowed. Big news? He wondered if maybe the donor had decided to make an appearance, or perhaps the funding had been approved even faster than expected. He dialed Emma's number. She answered almost breathlessly. "Hey, Hank, I just got word from a contact who says Horizon Wings might be planning a public event in our town, some sort of dedication ceremony tied to the grant. Have you heard anything?" Hank frowned. "No, Carol didn't mention anything like that. She only said we'd sign the agreement and we'd keep the press coverage local." "Well, my contact's reliable," Emma insisted. "They say the donor's pushing for a bigger gathering, with more media outlets, maybe even some state-level officials. You know how these philanthropic things can snowball." Hank's stomach gave a small lurch. He'd wanted the funds to help the county, not to become the centerpiece of a major spectacle. "I'll call Carol," he said finally. "I need to get the facts straight." After hanging up with Emma, he tried Carol's number. It rang a few times before she picked up, sounding harried. "Hank, hi. I'm glad you called. I was just about to reach out to you." "So there's talk of a big ceremony?" he said without preamble. "Emma mentioned it. Is that what Horizon Wings wants now?" She exhaled audibly. "I'm sorry you had to hear it secondhand. Our donor is thrilled by how your county has embraced the grant. They suggested a larger dedication event to showcase the collaborative spirit. It's still in early planning stages, but we didn't want to finalize anything without your blessing." Hank glanced at the rain dripping off his porch eaves. His reflection in the window showed a tense expression. "I'm grateful for the help, Carol, but I'm not sure a big public show is what we need. Folks around here, some will welcome the attention, but others might resent a flashy ceremony." "I understand," Carol said sympathetically. "We can keep it modest. The donor just enjoys celebrating successes, and they believe your story deserves a broader audience. Could be beneficial if state representatives see the project. It might lead to additional funding down the line." He pressed his lips together, torn. "Let me think on it. My gut says do what's best for the county, and if more publicity brings more resources, maybe it's worth it. But I'd want to ensure we don't turn this into a circus." "Completely agreed," Carol assured. "We'll proceed carefully. And Hank, I received your proposal. Looks great. The donor is reviewing it already." "Thanks. Let me know their feedback." After they hung up, Hank stayed by the phone a moment, wrestling with mixed feelings. He wanted the improvements for his community, and if a bigger event secured even more support, that was undeniably good. Still, he worried about losing control. He'd already had that taste of ceremony at the Riverton Air Show, but that had been relatively small. A multi-level event with big-shot officials could overshadow the true goal, practical help for the people here. He shoved the thoughts aside and spent the afternoon mending a fence along a far corner of the property. Physical labor steadied him, giving space for his mind to wander without anxiety taking root. By evening, he'd resolved to bring the matter to the county board. If they agreed a larger dedication might help, he'd go along. If they felt it was too much, he'd push back with them at his side. But before he could set that plan in motion, a new development rose. Late that night, Hank received a call from John Albright, an unexpected one, given that John usually left day-to-day matters to Carol. John's tone was brisk. "Hank, sorry to bother you after hours, but there's a pressing issue. We've uncovered evidence that someone's been impersonating Horizon Wings staff in your region." Hank's heart thumped. Impersonating? Why on earth? We're not entirely sure yet. Our best guess is they're trying to scam local officials, maybe to siphon funds once the grant is dispersed. We got wind of it when a county clerk from a different state reached out, questioning suspicious emails. That's unsettling, Hank said, a sinking feeling settling in his gut. Could it affect our county's money? It might. If these imposters trick people into sending payments or signing false documents, real damage could be done. We want you to be on alert. Carol is already notifying your county board, telling them to verify any communication that comes from us directly. Hank ran a hand over his chin, scanning his memory for anything suspicious. I don't recall any weird emails, but I'll double-check. Thanks for the heads up. John's voice softened. This kind of thing rarely happens, but the bigger a philanthropic effort gets, the more it attracts scammers. Don't worry, we'll make sure the real funds are secure. They ended the call. Hank set the phone down, unsettled. A wave of protectiveness rose in him. He felt responsible now, not just for the rescue that started this all, but for ensuring the grant process remained honest. He resolved to contact Ruben first thing tomorrow, warning him to vet any new messages carefully. Morning came, and Hank called Ruben, who confirmed he'd received Carol's alert. The county's IT team was already on guard for phishing attempts. We'll handle it, Hank, Ruben promised. You've done enough by bringing us the opportunity in the first place. Don't let these crooks ruin your day. Hank thanked him, though he couldn't shake the tension knotting his shoulders. He carried that feeling into the day's tasks, feeding goats, sorting feed orders, checking the forecast for the next planting window. Even mundane chores felt tinged with the worry that bad actors might overshadow a good thing. Mid-morning found him hauling a load of hay bales to the barn. As he stacked them, Emma Hopkins pulled into the driveway yet again, stepping out with her ever-present camera. Hank sighed good-naturedly. It seemed he'd become a staple on her news beat. She ambled over, mindful of the mud near the barn. Heard about the scam, she said, face somber. Can I get your statement for the 5 o'clock segment? People need to be warned to watch for imposters. Sure, he said, brushing hay from his gloves. But let's keep it factual. We don't want to scare folks away from the legitimate grant. She nodded, raising her camera. Exactly. Just a brief piece to remind everyone how to spot real communications from Horizon Wings. Hank obliged, explaining on camera that any official email would come directly from Carol or John, and that no one should pay money or sign documents unless they'd verified authenticity with the county. He spoke calmly, hoping to allay fears. The trouble was, in a rural place like theirs, scammers sometimes thrived on confusion and rumor. After Emma left, Hank felt exhaustion creep in. It wasn't physical tiredness, but mental fatigue. Would there ever be a day again where he just woke up to farm, rather than deal with swirling news stories? That evening, over a simple dinner of grilled chicken and vegetables, Hank found himself gazing at the plaque on his shelf. It gleamed under the warm kitchen light. Everything had spun out from one selfless act in a storm. He remembered that powerful flood current, the calf's frantic bleats. He'd had no clue then about the giant ripple he was creating. He finished his meal and checked his emails, relieved to see no suspicious messages. An update from Carol appeared in his inbox, reading, "Hello, Hank. We received excellent feedback from the donor. They're enthusiastic about the proposal. Also, we're coordinating closely with law enforcement to track the impersonators. Thanks again for your patience and cooperation. Carol." He typed a quick reply, thanking her. Then he settled on the porch with a glass of iced tea, watching twilight creep across the fields. The rain had stopped, leaving the air cool and sweet. He thought about Lucky, out there in Joe's pasture, probably dozing in the straw, none the wiser about how his rescue had embroiled Hank in a grand philanthropic drama. His phone chimed again. This time, a text from Joe, a photo of Lucky standing tall and proud. Joe had typed a short caption, "He's doing great. Come visit soon." Hank smiled, warmed by the reminder of the simple reason for all this fuss. As the stars blinked awake, Hank admitted to himself that, despite the headaches, he felt a deep sense of fulfillment. If scams were the price to pay for real progress, so be it. Over the next few days, the county board, Carol and John collectively sniffed out any shadowy attempts at infiltration. Luckily, the scam never gained traction locally. People were alert, thanks to Emma's coverage and Hank's public reminder. The rumor died down. A few folks muttered that this was proof big city money always brought trouble, but others remained hopeful that the good outweighed the bad. At last, Carol sent Hank the formal draft of the grant agreement. He read it carefully. The donor would provide a set amount of funds over the next year, managed through a local trust overseen by the county. Hank, in turn, would serve as liaison, ensuring the spirit of the donation stayed intact. There were no hidden clauses, no tricky language. Everything looked solid. The county board planned to sign it in a public session at the end of the month, setting the stage for official improvements to begin. Late one afternoon, Hank walked his fields, letting the soft earth cushion his steps. He ran a hand along the mended fence, remembering how he'd once worried about the cost of replacing damaged posts. Now, the entire county was on the verge of receiving a major boost in fortifying farmland. He paused by a wide bend in the river, where the waters now flowed peacefully. Here the flood had been fiercest that night. The memories of how the river surged and threatened to devour that calf still made his heart pound if he let his mind drift back. As the gentle current whispered against the shore, Hank took a moment to breathe in gratitude. A farmer's life didn't often leave room for dramatic twists and new beginnings, but here he was, living one. And though he still had doubts about public fanfare, he couldn't deny the rightness of seeing his neighbors equipped for the future. He found himself silently thanking Lucky, the calf who'd unintentionally pulled them all into this. A glimmer of sunlight on the water caught his eye, and in that sparkle, he thought he saw possibility, like scattered seeds, waiting to grow into something strong and resilient. 2 weeks later, Hank stood outside the county courthouse, shifting his weight as a small crowd gathered. The official signing of the Horizon Wings grant agreement was about to happen. On the steps, a makeshift podium faced a scattering of folding chairs and curious onlookers. A sense of nervous excitement rippled through the air. Hank tried to find a calm center, reminding himself this ceremony was the final step before real change could begin. Stronger levees, better rescue equipment, scholarships for farm kids. Ruben Delgado waved him over with a broad smile. "Hank, glad you're here. We're starting in 5 minutes." Beside Ruben, Emma Hopkins and 2 other local reporters fussed with cameras and microphones. She caught Hank's eye and gave a thumbs up. Then Hank noticed Carol Donahue, wearing a neat blazer, speaking quietly with a man Hank didn't recognize. Likely more folks from Horizon Wings, he thought. He took his seat in the front row. The courthouse, a stately brick building with tall columns, made for an imposing backdrop. Nearby, a flurry of suits and county officials mingled, eager to be part of the milestone. Hank felt a slight chill even in the morning sun. He wished he'd worn something heavier than his thin jacket, but nerves also explained the goosebumps on his arms. Ruben stepped up to the podium, tapping the microphone to test it. "Good morning, everyone," he began, voice echoing across the plaza. "We gather here today to formalize an extraordinary partnership between our county and Horizon Wings. This grant agreement signifies a new chapter in how we protect our farmland, our livestock, and our citizens from future floods." He paused for applause, which came in polite waves. "I want to thank Henry Thatcher for his pivotal role. If he hadn't performed that selfless rescue, none of this might have happened." Heads turned Hank's way. He offered a tight-lipped smile, feeling the warmth of attention intensify. Emma's camera zoomed in, capturing his reaction. Carol approached the mic next, speaking about Horizon Wings' mission. She outlined the key points of the grant: $500,000 earmarked for flood defenses, specialized training for emergency crews, and scholarships aimed at rural youth pursuing agricultural innovation. Hank felt the figure land on him like a heavy weight. $500,000 was far beyond anything he'd imagined when he first pulled that calf from the flood. Then came his turn. Carol beckoned him to stand beside her. The moment he stepped to the mic, a hush fell. He swallowed hard, gripping the wooden podium. "I'm no public speaker," he began softly, his voice carrying surprising steadiness. "I'm just grateful this all came together. A couple months ago, we had a terrifying flood. I never thought wading out to save a calf would lead to a day like this, but here we are. I want to thank Horizon Wings for believing in our community, and I want to thank our county board for working so diligently on a plan that'll help everyone. This isn't about me. It's about all of us, standing ready for the next storm." Applause broke out, more heartfelt this time. Hank stepped back, cheeks flushed. Carol offered him a grateful nod before turning to the table set up with formal documents. She and Reuben signed on behalf of their respective organizations, pen strokes that symbolized months of negotiation. Then they gestured Hank forward. Though he wasn't an official representative of the county, the donor insisted Hank add his signature as a community ambassador. It felt odd, almost pretentious, but he did it, handwriting trembling a bit. Cameras flashed. When the applause died down, Reuben held the signed agreement aloft. "It's done," he announced. "Funding will be released within the month. Let's give one more round of thanks to Hank Thatcher for lighting the spark, and to Horizon Wings for fueling the flame." The crowd cheered. Hank spotted a few familiar faces: Joe Patterson beaming from the sidelines, Marta Reyes, the councilwoman, wiping her eyes, and a handful of neighbors who'd shown up just to witness history. Emma motioned from behind her camera, mouthing the words, "Great job." Relief washed through him. Finally, the procedural part was finished. Now the real work could begin. Afterward, a small reception took place inside the courthouse lobby, where local volunteers had set up coffee and pastries. Hank joined Carol at a corner table, inhaling the sweet smell of cinnamon rolls. She extended a hand. "Thank you for trusting us. I know the publicity made you uneasy, but you did well today." He shook her hand warmly. "Still feels surreal, but I appreciate the support. When do we start rolling out the projects?" Carol laughed gently. "Give us a couple weeks to finalize disbursement details, then the county can access funds for the levy contracts, the training courses, and so on. Meanwhile, our donor wants to schedule a follow-up visit, maybe an in-person tour of the flood-prone areas they're helping fix." Hank raised his eyebrows. "So they might finally show themselves?" "Possibly," Carol said with a smile, though she didn't elaborate. "They like to stay private, but they sometimes appear in person once a project is underway. I'll keep you posted." He nodded, excitement flickering beneath his calm exterior. Part of him was curious about this mystery donor who'd orchestrated so much, including that first Squadron flyover. Perhaps he'd never meet them, but a tiny voice in the back of his mind hoped for answers. The rest of the reception blended into warm handshakes and scattered praise. By midday, Hank slipped away, explaining he had farm chores to attend to. The fresh signature on the grant felt like a completion of sorts, yet he knew it was merely the foundation for everything to come. Back at his farm, under a gentle sunshine, he donned work clothes and hurried to clean the goat stalls. Doreen, his oldest nanny goat, had been acting fussy. Hank suspected she might be due for a vet visit. He calmed her with soft words, reflecting that once upon a time, an entire day could pass without major interruption. Now it seemed every morning brought fresh emails, calls, or visitors. Yet, as he mucked the straw in Doreen's stall, he found comfort in the ordinary rhythms of caring for animals. After finishing, he walked to the spot near the river where he'd once rescued Lucky. The water level was calm now, inching lazily around bends. Standing at the bank, Hank replayed the memory of that night in his mind. The thunder, the swirling current, the helpless bleat. He marveled at how nature could flip from ferocious to gentle so quickly. His phone chimed, jarring him. He fished it from his pocket. Emma's number again. Pressing accept, he heard background chatter and rustling paper. "Hank, hi. Quick heads up. I'm doing a follow-up story on the grant's approval and need some footage at your farm. Maybe tomorrow?" He chuckled under his breath. "Sure, Emma. I'll be here." "Great. Also, how do you feel about flying to Chicago next month?" Hank almost dropped the phone. "Chicago? What on earth for?" "Word is the State Agriculture Expo wants you to speak about the value of community-driven aid. It's only a panel discussion, but still." He exhaled, eyes drifting to the slow-moving river. "That's quite a leap. Let me guess. Horizon Wings put me on their list of potential speakers?" Emma laughed. "I wouldn't be surprised if they recommended you. Anyway, the Expo folks asked if I'd connect them with you. Just think about it. Could highlight how rural areas can support each other in crises." Hank's mind whirled. "I'll consider it, but I'm not exactly a polished speaker. You know me." "Exactly," Emma teased. "You're authentic, which is what people want to hear. No rush. They'll likely reach out in a few days." He ended the call, gazing down at the phone like it was a tricky puzzle. Public speaking in a big city, in front of experts. He stepped back from the river, ironically feeling a swell of nerves that rivaled the adrenaline he'd felt that flood night. Yet again, he told himself to keep an open mind. If it served the greater good, maybe he should step up. The next day, Emma arrived with her cameraman to film Hank's farm. They focused on the improvements he'd made post-flood, the goats he cared for daily, and the overall serenity of the land. Hank answered her questions while standing in front of a repaired fence line. Emma crafted a narrative about resilience, contrasting the devastation of the storm with the hope the grant now brought. In one shot, the cameraman panned to the horizon where the river shimmered, then zoomed back on Hank's face. Emma leaned in. "Last question. How do you stay grounded through all these changes?" Hank chuckled, resting a hand on the fence. "When you have chores waiting at sunrise, critters needing food, fences needing mending, it keeps your feet planted. That. And I remember I'm not doing this for myself. It's for the county and for families who won't have to fear the next big flood so much." Emma grinned, clearly satisfied. After they left, Hank felt a quiet contentment. Perhaps the best way to handle his growing profile was to remain steadfastly himself. The goats, the farmland, the morning routine, that was who Hank Thatcher was. Meanwhile, local committees began forming to oversee each slice of the grant. Hank joined the flood defense team, along with engineers and zoning officials, discussing which levee segments needed urgent fortification. Another group tackled rescue training, lining up professionals to lead classes at the fire station. A smaller committee handled the scholarship portion, reaching out to high school counselors. Each time Hank sat in on these meetings, he noticed something. Neighbors were collaborating more efficiently than ever before, energized by the influx of resources. He also saw new faces volunteering, young adults eager to be part of the county's transformation. It was as if the entire community had awakened to the idea that they could steer their future, rather than being helpless against nature's whims. Hank felt privileged to witness it. Yes, the work was only beginning. Yes, obstacles would arise. But the spirit of unity was strong, and it fueled him each day. One evening, as the sun dipped low, he called Joe Patterson. "How's Lucky?" he asked, leaning against his porch railing. "Growing like a weed," Joe answered with a laugh. "He's part of the herd now, though you can still spot him. He's the only one that tries to nudge open the gate." Hank smiled. "That calf doesn't know how much he's shaped this place." "Don't forget, you shaped it too," Joe said gently. "If it wasn't for your stubborn kindness, we wouldn't have this grant or these programs." Hank gazed at the fields, gold in the fading sunlight, and recalled the terror of that flood night. From that chaos, an unthinkable opportunity had sprung. "Well," he replied quietly, "sometimes you plant seeds, and you don't realize what'll grow." Joe's warm chuckle came through the phone. "Amen to that. Come visit soon. Lucky might let you scratch his ears." They said their goodbyes, and Hank hung up. He watched shadows lengthen across his yard, reflecting on how a single rescue had done what decades of county efforts hadn't: drawn in big resources, galvanized community involvement, and restored a sense of hope. He felt no arrogance, only gratitude and a sense of humble wonder. Tomorrow, he'd pour that quiet determination into another day of chores and meetings, mindful that even the simplest acts could bloom into something grand. Spring settled into the county with a gentle warmth, coaxing wildflowers to bloom at the edges of Hank's fields. Where the ground had once been saturated by floodwaters, fresh shoots now pushed through, promising a good planting season. The newfound sense of renewal mirrored how folks felt about the grant. Workers had already begun reinforcing levees in the most vulnerable spots along the river, trucks rumbling in daily with concrete barriers and fresh loads of dirt. Hank sometimes drove out just to watch, awe mixing with satisfaction. It was happening, and faster than he'd dared hope. On the mornings he wasn't overseeing progress, Hank found himself invited to speak at local gatherings. Civic clubs asked for his perspective on community resilience. The high school agriculture teacher had him give another talk, this time to seniors who peppered him with bright-eyed questions about the scholarship fund. Though public speaking still made him uneasy, he managed to find a calm center whenever he remembered why it mattered. He often told the students, "If a crisis hits, you might be the one to step up. Don't underestimate what you can do for someone in need." One breezy afternoon, Hank returned home from a meeting at the volunteer fire station, where they'd just taken delivery of newly funded water rescue gear, to find an unfamiliar SUV parked by his barn. His first thought was that Emma had popped in again for footage, but as he climbed out of his truck, two men he didn't recognize stepped onto his porch. One was tall and angular, wearing a crisp black suit. The other had a military bearing, short gray hair, and a subdued tie. Hank felt a flicker of concern. "Mr. Thatcher?" the suited man asked, stepping forward with a polite smile. "I'm Russell Boyd from the Department of Agriculture, and this is Michael Grant from the Department of the Interior. We'd like a moment of your time." Hank frowned, but he tipped his head in greeting. "Federal folks? Did I miss some paperwork?" Boyd offered a thin chuckle. "Not exactly. We're here because of your newfound role in shaping disaster preparedness. Word travels fast, and we think your county's approach could be a model for other rural regions. We'd like to learn more about the specific measures you're funding." Hank relaxed slightly. "I see. Usually the county board handles that talk, but I'm willing to share what I know. Come on in." He opened the door, leading them into his living room, where the lingering smell of fresh coffee mingled with the earthy scent from his boots by the door. The men politely declined coffee, and they sat around Hank's battered wooden table. Boyd removed a notepad from his jacket, flipping the cover with efficient motions. "We understand you've established committees for levee work, rescue training, and scholarships. Could you speak to the success thus far?" Hank described the progress in straightforward terms, careful not to overstate. The men asked detailed questions, as though compiling a formal report. Hank felt a bit like he was being audited, but he sensed no malice, more like professional curiosity. After about 20 minutes, Michael Grant spoke up, his tone warmer than Boyd's. "We also heard you might appear at a state-level agriculture expo soon. Is that confirmed?" Hank sighed inwardly, recalling Emma's nudge. "I haven't decided. I got an invitation, but public panels aren't my usual." "Why do you ask?" Grant exchanged a look with Boyd. "It'd be beneficial for more rural communities to see what's possible. We'd be there too, presenting on federal support for flood mitigation. If you shared your story, it might encourage other counties to adopt similar models. Hank scratched his chin. So you're saying I'd be a positive example from the grassroots side, and you'd speak from the government side? Precisely, said Boyd, leaning forward. We see synergy here. Public, private, and local efforts combining for better preparedness. Your success is the perfect illustration. A swirl of conflict rose in Hank's mind. He wanted to remain a simple farmer, not some poster child. Yet the idea that his story might help other places felt compelling. I'll talk with the expo organizers, he said at last. If it helps folks, I'll consider it. They concluded their discussion soon after, each official shaking Hank's hand with polite thanks. As the SUV pulled away, Hank let out a breath. He hadn't asked for this, but maybe it was just part of the bigger wave of attention swirling around. He'd adapt as best he could. That evening, he called Emma, who confirmed that the expo organizers were pushing for his involvement. She was thrilled at the possibility of covering it. You'll do fine, she assured him. The more eyes on these programs, the better. Think about all the rural towns that don't know how to start. You can show them the blueprint. Hank replied with a rueful chuckle. Blueprint might be a strong word. More like stumbling around until we found the right folks to help. Emma just laughed, calling him modest. When he ended the call, he thought back to the day of the flood rescue, how unplanned and frantic it had been. If only folks realized how little he'd orchestrated any of this. Yet, ironically, it was that exact honesty that drew attention. Perhaps in a world of well-crafted sound bites, a farmer who spoke plainly was a refreshing change. On a crisp Saturday, he joined a group from the volunteer fire station to test the new water rescue suits at a calm stretch of river. Hank mostly observed, handing out towels and coffee. Rosa Miller led the drill, demonstrating how to maneuver a rescue raft and secure a victim. Watching them practice, Hank felt profound relief. Next time the waters rose, they'd be ready. When the drill concluded, Rosa clapped his shoulder. We couldn't have afforded this gear without your help, Hank. And these training sessions, potentially life-saving. He lowered his gaze, feeling the weight of gratitude. Just keep doing good work. That's thanks enough. A few days later, Carol called with an unexpected announcement. Hank, she said cheerily, the donor will be in town next week to survey the levee improvements. They'd like you to accompany them. I know this is short notice, but can you spare an afternoon? Hank's heart jolted. You mean the person behind all this? They're coming here? Yes, they prefer anonymity, so we won't make it a public spectacle. But they do want to see where their funds are going. It would help if you walked them through the areas being fixed. Hank couldn't deny a stirring of curiosity. I'll be there. Just tell me when. That set off a quiet countdown in Hank's mind. He imagined meeting some aloof billionaire with bodyguards, but he pushed aside preconceptions. He prepared by visiting the levee sites in advance, talking to the construction crews about progress. Early on the chosen day, he tidied his truck, wanting a decent ride for his unidentified passenger. He didn't need it looking like he'd never met a vacuum. At noon, Carol arrived at his farm in a sleek rental car. To Hank's surprise, only one other person emerged. No entourage. The donor turned out to be a petite woman in her mid-50s, with practical boots and a no-nonsense haircut that hinted at efficiency. Carol introduced her as Ms. Lee, no first name offered. She greeted Hank with a genuine smile that didn't feel pompous at all. Mr. Thatcher, a pleasure, she said. Call me Lee, please. I've read quite a bit about you. May we drive to the levees? Hank nodded, opening the passenger door of his pickup. Carol climbed into her own car to follow behind. As Hank started the engine, Ms. Lee settled in. The only giveaway of her wealth was a discreet watch that looked expensive. Otherwise, she seemed at ease in his rattling truck, rolling down the window to feel the breeze. They drove out to the river, past farmland that still bore hints of the earlier flood's path. Ms. Lee asked thoughtful questions, about local topography, the roles of volunteer crews, the business of day-to-day farm life. Hank answered openly, gradually losing his initial nerves. She never once boasted or name-dropped. If anything, she listened more than she spoke. Reaching the construction area, Hank parked on a muddy shoulder. The two of them strolled to the levee embankment, where workers in reflective vests were placing heavy stones. Ms. Lee observed with keen interest, occasionally jotting notes in a small pad. Carol joined them, offering technical details gleaned from the engineers. They spent an hour walking the length of the new structure, glimpsing where the water had once broken through. Finally, Ms. Lee turned to Hank. "Does this meet your expectations?" He paused, taking in the sight of fresh concrete and carefully layered rock designed to withstand a future deluge. "It's more than I imagined. People here have wanted improvements for decades, but we never had the funds or the momentum. Now we do." She nodded, expression content. "I'm glad. Our foundation invests in projects that strengthen communities at their core. From everything I've heard, that's exactly what's happening here." They headed back to the vehicles, boots squelching in the wet soil. As Hank opened the passenger door for Ms. Lee again, he felt a surge of gratitude that she had the means, and apparently the will, to make a difference. On the drive back to his farm, she complimented the scenic beauty of the county and asked about the goats, the scholarship program, and the local volunteer fire crew. By the time they parked at Hank's place, it was as though he'd been chatting with a neighbor rather than a secretive donor. Carol approached them in the driveway, giving Ms. Lee an inquisitive glance. Ms. Lee responded with a small nod. "Everything looks good. I'll finalize the next donation installment soon." Hank blinked. "Next installment? I thought we had the main portion already." Carol grinned. "There's a supplemental amount available if Ms. Lee deems it warranted after seeing the results." Ms. Lee extended her hand to Hank. "I see the passion in this county. I'm not promising a fortune, but I believe in reinforcing success. You'll hear from us shortly." He shook her hand, feeling genuinely touched. "Thank you, Ms. Lee. I can't tell you how much this means." She gave a polite dip of her head, then climbed into Carol's car. In seconds, they were gone. Hank stood there, hands still tingling from the handshake, absorbing the magnitude of her words. A second donation. More resources for farmland, rescue operations, or new ideas the county might dream up. He let out a slow breath, realizing that far from winding down, this entire journey might be expanding yet again. He glanced across his yard, imagining a future where floods no longer spelled disaster for his neighbors, where kids soared on scholarships to reshape farming for the next generation. The sense of possibility almost knocked the breath out of him. Quietly, he set about his late afternoon chores with a renewed sense of purpose, letting each movement of feeding and tending hum with hope. In the weeks following Ms. Lee's visit, the county bustled with the kind of optimism Hank had rarely seen in his lifetime. Crews pressed forward on levee fortifications, raising them an extra few feet in particularly low-lying spots. The volunteer fire department posted photos of their new rescue gear on social media, proudly showing off the bright orange suits and updated raft. High school students began applying for the scholarships, many of them brimming with bold ideas for agriculture, hydroponic greenhouses, soil improvement studies, and more. All the while, Hank's name kept cropping up as the humble catalyst behind it all. He tried to keep a low profile, but word spread that another donation installment might soon arrive. That rumor stoked excitement. Even longtime skeptics were forced to admit the results spoke for themselves. The improvements were tangible, not just talk. On more than one occasion, neighbors stopped Hank in the feed store to thank him, some wearing shy smiles as though unsure how to praise a man they'd known for years. He responded with the same honest refrain, "This isn't just me. We all made it happen." Meanwhile, Emma Hopkins continued her coverage. She put together a heartwarming piece about Lucky, the once stranded calf who had grown into a sturdy, energetic yearling. That segment, aired across the region, featured footage of Lucky kicking up his heels in Joe Patterson's pasture while children giggled at his antics. Emma narrated with her usual flair, calling Lucky the symbol of a flood rescue that sparked a county's rebirth. Hank watched that broadcast with a mix of fondness and embarrassment, remembering how small the calf had been that night, trembling in Hank's arms. As spring melted into early summer, crops took root in the fields, promising a decent yield despite the late planting. Hank tended his goats faithfully, found time to help Joe with his own repairs, and attended a steady stream of committee meetings about how best to manage the first wave of grant money. Little by little, they tackled the priorities they'd agreed upon, ticking them off as each project reached a new milestone. About a month after Ms. Lee's tour, Hank received an official-looking envelope with a return address from Horizon Wings. Inside was a simple letter confirming the supplemental donation, along with a note from Ms. Lee herself. She thanked Hank for demonstrating how neighbors could unite for a shared goal, then wrote, "We're delighted to see what else this community can accomplish." The additional funds weren't quite as large as the original amount, but the figure still astonished Hank. He told no one but the county board until they decided how to announce it publicly. He found himself unexpectedly nostalgic some evenings, thinking back to his parents and grandparents. They'd farmed this land in quieter times, relying on grit and the goodwill of neighbors. How would they react to seeing corporate-style infusions of money? Would they worry about losing tradition, or rejoice at the new security for future generations? Whenever these thoughts nagged at him, Hank told himself the essence of farming, taking care of the land and each other, remained the same, no matter the source of funding. Then came the matter of the State Agriculture Expo. Invitations and phone calls persisted, each one urging him to speak on a panel about rural resilience. He'd never traveled far from home, let alone visited a sprawling convention center filled with agricultural experts. But as Ms. Lee noted in her letter, success stories could inspire others. Emma pitched a new angle for her own coverage. Hank Thatcher goes to the big city to share farmland wisdom. He cringed at the headline, though he suspected it might amuse local viewers. At last, Hank decided to accept. The expo was only 2 hours by car from his county. He made a plan: drive in, speak briefly, and drive out before evening chores. Emma promised to tag along, filming a short feature for her news station. Despite his nerves, Hank reasoned that if one or two other communities launched projects like theirs, it would justify the day's discomfort. On the morning of the expo, he rose before the sun, checked on his goats, then slipped into a tidy button-down shirt. The drive was pleasant at first, familiar farmland rolling by. But soon tall buildings and congested highways replaced the open horizon. Hank tried not to grip the steering wheel too tightly as traffic funneled him into a maze of ramps. Emma's small SUV followed close behind, the plan being to park together. They found a spot in a towering garage and walked into the expo, where a swirl of booths and bright banners greeted them. The cavernous hall hummed with voices and footsteps, aisles of displays showing off cutting-edge tractors, advanced irrigation systems, and genetically refined seeds. Hank felt like a fish out of water, even though these products were meant for farmers like him. The sheer scale dwarfed his everyday world of mending fences and driving an old pickup. Emma guided him to a side hallway leading to the panel discussion room. About 50 chairs faced a dais where a moderator and 2 other speakers sat. One was a professor from the state university, the other a local extension officer. When Hank entered, the moderator smiled, beckoning him to take the last seat. Emma settled in the back with her camera, sending Hank an encouraging nod. Nerves clutched at him as the moderator introduced each speaker. The professor spoke first, rattling off statistics about climate changes causing more frequent floods. The extension officer highlighted government grants, listing the usual red tape processes. By the time it was Hank's turn, his pulse pounded in his ears. The moderator gave a short summary of his story, describing how a single rescue had spiraled into a county-wide transformation. Hank cleared his throat, leaning toward the microphone. "I'm no scientist," he began quietly, "and I sure don't know the ins and outs of national policy. But I do know my county got hit by a bad flood. When I found a stranded calf, I did what any decent neighbor would do. Saved him from drowning." He paused, eyes scanning the audience. They leaned forward, intrigued by his plain words. "I didn't expect attention. I didn't expect money either. But one good deed led to a connection with a donor who believed in our folks. Now we're shoring up levees, upgrading rescue equipment, and helping kids pursue new farming ideas." He glanced at the other panelists, then the crowd. "What I've learned is this: communities can't wait around for top-down solutions. Sometimes it starts with you, doing something small, and then you build on that." Applause broke out, stronger than he'd anticipated. The moderator asked a couple of follow-up questions, then opened the floor to the audience. Hands shot up. Someone asked Hank how he'd ensured accountability for the funds. Another asked how smaller farms could replicate his success. The questions made him realize how valuable the synergy truly was. Local government, philanthropic groups, and everyday people all working together. By the end of the panel, Hank felt oddly invigorated. The professor and extension officer both shook his hand, commending him on bridging the gap between theory and reality. A few folks from neighboring counties rushed up, eager to chat about best practices. Emma captured it all on camera, no doubt piecing together a compelling story. In a whirlwind, Hank found himself outside again, blinking in the bright midday sun. They'd wrapped up earlier than expected. Emma approached, microphone tucked under her arm. "That was amazing. I'll have plenty of footage for a great segment. How do you feel?" He exhaled, smiling shyly. Relieved mostly, surprised too. Didn't realize folks would be so interested. They were more than interested. They were inspired, Emma said, beaming. "I bet you'll see new partnerships forming all around. This expo's crawling with innovators." They parted ways in the parking garage. Emma had more interviews to chase, while Hank was eager to get back to the farm before dusk. As he drove home, mind buzzing with the questions and admiration he'd received, he realized something had changed within him. He wasn't the timid farmer who hated the spotlight anymore. He'd seen how sharing his experiences could help others. Far from being a burden, it felt like an honorable duty. When he finally arrived at his farm, the sun was tipping toward the horizon. He rushed through the barn, greeting his goats and checking that all was well. Doreen gazed at him with calm acceptance, as though saying, "I knew you'd be back." For a moment he just stood there, breathing in the sweet scent of hay, the swirl of dust motes catching the late-day light. He stepped back outside, pausing on his porch to watch the sky fade into lavender. This land had been his anchor through every twist, from the day he'd dragged a frightened calf out of the flood, to the exhilarating swirl of philanthropic grants, to standing before a crowd of strangers to say that one act of kindness could ignite a community. His farm was the constant. He closed his eyes, remembering Lucky's braying cry that rainy night. Perhaps even then, fate was nudging him toward a bigger calling. A gentle breeze carried the scent of budding wildflowers from the far pasture. Hank opened his eyes, heart brimming with gratitude. He could see a future where farmland across the region was better protected, where rescue crews stood ready to save both animals and people in peril, where bright students discovered farming innovations that would feed generations to come, and in the center of it all, an ordinary farmer who had acted on instinct, bridging the gap between daily life and destiny. He walked down the porch steps, hat in hand. Tomorrow would bring more tasks, more conversations about how to spend Ms. Lee's supplemental donation, more calls from folks wanting to replicate his county's model. But for now, Hank took comfort in the hush of twilight. He ran a hand across the sturdy porch railing, grateful for the blessings that had come from one desperate rescue. With a slow breath, he headed out to gather the goats. ready to face the evening chores with a steady, unhurried grace, just as he always had, and just as he always would.